Here's the instant replay, so pay attention. Point 1. The Greys. Probably no more than delivery systems for the Byrus are gone already. The one the environment didn't kill, like the microbes finally killed the Martians in War of the Worlds, were wiped out by our gunships. All but one, that is. The one, must be, that I got my information from. And in a physical sense, he's gone too. Point 2. The weasels don't work. Like all cancers, they ultimately eat themselves to death. The weasels can't escape from the lower intestine or the bowel quickly in an environment they find hostile. Point 3. The Byrus doesn't work either, not very well, but given a chance, given time to hide and grow, it could mutate, learn to fit in, maybe to rule. "We are going to wipe it out," Underhill said. "We are going to turn the entire Jefferson Tract into a burn scar." Henry could have screamed with frustration. Some of that must have gotten through. There was a thud as Underhill jerked, striking the flimsy shed wall with his back. "What you do up here doesn't matter," Henry said. "The people you've got interned can't spread it, the weasels can't spread it, and the Byrus can't spread itself. If your guys folded their tents, the environment would take care of itself and erase all this nonsense like a bad equation. I think the Greys showed up the way they did because they just can't fucking believe it. I think it was a suicide mission with some Grey version of Mr. Kurtz in charge. They simply can't conceptualize failure. We always win, they think. How do you..." Then at the last minute, Underhill, maybe at the last second, one of them found a man who was remarkably different from all the others with whom the Greys, the Weasels, and the Byrus had come in contact. "He is your typhoid, Mary, and he is already out of the Q zone, rendering anything you do here meaningless." Gary Jones. Jonesy, right. What makes him different? Little as he wanted to go into the part of it, Henry realized he had to give Underhill something. He and I and our other two friends, the ones who are dead, once knew someone who was very different. A natural telepath. No Byrus needed. He did something for us. If we gotten to know him when we were a little older, I don't think that would have been possible, but we met him when we were particularly vulnerable. I suppose you'd say to what he had. And then years later something else happened to Jonesy. Something that has nothing to do with this remarkable boy. But that wasn't the truth, Henry suspected. Although Jonesy had been hit and almost killed in Cambridge, and Durrett's had never, to Henry's knowledge, been south of Derry in his life. Duds has somehow been a part of Jonesy's final crucial change, a part of that too. He knew it. And I'm supposed to what? Just believe all this, swallow it like cough syrup? In the sweet-smelling darkness of the shed, Henry's lips spread in a humorless grin. "Owen," he said, "you do believe it. I'm a telepath, remember? The baddest one in the jungle. The question is... Henry asked the question with his mind. Standing outside the compound fence by the back wall of the old storage shed, freezing his balls off, filter mask pulled down around his neck so that he could smoke a series of cigarettes he did not want. He'd gotten a fresh pack in the PX. Owen would have said he never felt less like laughing in his life. But when the man in the shed responded to his eminently reasonable question with such impatient directness, "You do believe it. I'm a telepath, remember?" A laugh was surprised out of him nevertheless. Kurtz has said if the telepathy became permanent and were to spread, society as they knew it would fall down. Owen had grasped the concept, but now he understood it on a gut level too. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Tired as he was, Owen could see only one answer to that question. He'll have to go after Jones, I suppose. Will it do any good? Do we have time? I think we might just. Owen tried to read what was behind Henry's response with his lesser powers and could not. Yet he was positive that most of what the man had told him was true. Either that or he believes it's true, Owen thought. God knows what I want to believe it's true. Any excuse to get out of here before the butchery starts. No, Henry said, and for the first time, Owen thought he sounded upset, not entirely sure of himself. No butchery. Kurtz isn't going to kill somewhere between 200 and 800 people. People who ultimately can't influence his business one way or the other. They are just innocent bystanders. Owen wasn't entirely surprised to find himself rather enjoying his new friend's discomfort. God knew Henry had discomforted him. What do you suggest, bearing in mind that you yourself said that your pal Jonesy matters? Yes, but... Floundering, Henry's mental voice was a little surer, but now a little. I didn't mean we'll walk away and let them die. We won't be walking anywhere, Owen said. We'll be running like a couple of rats in a corn crib. He dropped his third cigarette after a final token puff and watched the wind carry it away. Beyond the shed, curtains of snow rippled across the empty corral, building up huge drifts against the side of the barn. Trying to go anywhere in this world would be madness. It will have to be a snowcat at least to start with, Owen thought. By midnight, even a four-wheel drive might not be much good, not in this. Kill Kurtz, Henry said. That's the answer. It'll make it easier for us to get away with no one to give orders, and it will put the biological cleansing on hold. Owen laughed dryly. You make it sound so easy, he said. 00 Underhill, license to kill. He lit a fourth cigarette, cupping his hands around the lighter and the end of the smoke. In spite of his gloves, his fingers were numb. We better come to some conclusions pretty quick, he thought, before I freeze to death. What's the big deal about it? Henry asked, but he knew what the big deal was, all right. Owen could sense and half hear him, trying not to see it, not wanting things to be worse than they already were. Just walk in there and pop him. Wouldn't work. Owen sent Henry a brief message. Freddie Johnson and other members of the so-called Imperial Valley cadre keeping an eye on Kurtz's Winnebago. Also, he's got some place wired for sound. If anything happens, the hard boys come running. Maybe I could get him, probably not, because he covers himself as thoroughly as any Colombian cocaine jefe. Especially when he's on active duty, but maybe. I'd like to think I'm not bad myself, but it would be a suicide mission. If he's recruited Freddie Johnson, then he's probably got Kate Gallagher and Marvel Richardson, Carl Friedman, Jocelyn McAvoy. Tough boys and tough girls, Henry. I kill Kurtz, they kill me. The brass running this show from under Cheyenne Mountain sent out a new cleaner. Some Kurtz clone that'll pick up where Kurtz left off. Or maybe they just select Kate to the job. God knows she's crazy enough. People in the barn might get 12 additional hours to stew their own juice, but in the end, they'll still burn. The only difference is that instead of getting a chance to go charging gaily through the snowstorm with me, handsome, you'll burn with the rest of them. Your pal, meanwhile, this guy Jonesy, he'll be off to... To where? That's something it might be prudent for me to keep to myself for the time being. Owen nonetheless probed for it with such telepathy as he possessed. For a moment he caught a blurred and perplexing vision, a tall white building in the snow, cylindrical like a barn silo, and then it was gone, replaced by the image of a white horse that looked almost like a unicorn running past a sign. On the sign were red letters reading Banbury Cross under a pointing arrow. He grunted in amusement and exasperation. You're jamming me. You can think of it in that way, or you can think of it as teaching you a technique. You better learn if you'd like to keep our conversation a secret. Owen wasn't entirely displeased with what had just happened. For one thing, a jamming technique would be a very good thing to have. For another, Henry did know where his infected friend, call him Typhoid Jonesy, was going. Owen had a brief picture of it in Henry's head. Henry, I want you to listen to me now. All right? Here's the simplest, safest thing you can do. You and I. First, if time isn't an utterly crucial factor, we both need to get some sleep. I can buy that. I'm next door to dead. Then around 3 o'clock, I can start to move and shake. This installation is going to be on high alert till the time when there isn't an installation here any longer. But if Big Brother's eyeball ever gazes over a little, it's apt to be between 4 and 6 a.m. I'll make a diversion and I can short out the fence. That's the easiest part actually. I can be there. I can be here with the snowcat 5 minutes after the shit hits the fan. Telepathy had certain shorthand advantages to verbal communication, Owen was discovering. He sent Henry the image of a burning MH6 Little Bird helicopter and soldiers running toward it even if as he continued to speak. And off we go. Leaving Kurtz with a barn full of innocent civilians, he plans to turn into crispy critters, not to mention the Blue Group. What's that, a couple 300 more? Owen, who had been full-time military since the age of 19 and one of Kurtz's razorheads for the last 8 years, sent 2 hard words along with the mental conduit the two of them had established. Acceptable losses. Behind the dirty glass, the vague shape that was Henry Devlin stirred, then stood. "No," he said back. "No? What do you mean, no?" "No, that's what I mean. Do you have a better idea?" And Owen realized to his extreme horror that Henry thought he did. Fragments of that idea. It would be far too generous to call it a plan. Shot through Owen's mind like a brightly fragmented tail of a comet. It took his breath away. The cigarette dropped unnoticed from between his fingers and zipped away on the wind. "You are nuts." "No, I'm not. We need a diversion in order to get away. You already know that. This is a diversion. They'll be killed anyway. Some will, even most of them. But it's a chance. What chance will they have in a burning barn?" Out loud, Henry said, "And there's Kurtz. If he's got a couple of 100 escapees to worry about, most of whom would be happy to tell the first reporters they came across that the panic-stricken US government had sanctioned a My Lai massacre right here on American soil, it's going to be a lot less concerned about us." You don't know Abe Kurtz, Owen thought. You don't know about Kurtz's line, of course. Neither did he. Not really, not until today. Yet, Henry's proposal made a lunatic kind of sense, and it contained at least a measure of atonement. As this endless November 14th marched towards midnight, and as odds of living until the end of the week grew longer, Owen was not surprised to find that the idea of atonement had its attractions. "Henry." "Yes, Owen, I'm here. I've always felt bad about what I did in the Rapallo's house that day." "I know. And yet I've done it again and again. How fucked up is that?" Henry, an excellent psychiatrist, even after his thoughts had turned to suicide, said nothing. Fucked up was a normal human behavior, sad but true. "All right," Owen said, at last. "You can buy the house, but I'm going to furnish it. Deal?" "Deal," Henry replied at once. "Can you really teach me that jamming technique, because I think I may need it?" "I'm pretty sure I can." "All right, listen." Owen talked for the next 3 minutes, sometimes out loud, sometimes mind to mind. The two men had reached a point where they no longer differentiated between the modes of communication. Thoughts and words had become one. "It's hot in Goslin's. It's so hot." The sweat pops on Jonesy's face almost immediately, and by the time the 4 of them get to the payphone, which is near the wood stove, wouldn't you know it? It's rolling down his cheeks, and his armpits feel like jungle growth after a heavy rain. Not that he has all that much growth there yet, not at 14. Don't you wish, as Pete likes to say. So it's hot, and it's still partly in the grip of the dream, which hasn't faded the way bad dreams usually do. He can still smell gasoline and burning rubber, and can see Henry holding that moccasin and the head. He can still see Richie Granado's awful severed head. Then the operator makes things worse by being a bitch. Then Jonesy gives her the Cavell's number, which they call frequently to ask if they can come over. Roberta and Alfie always say yes, but it is only polite to ask permission. They have all been taught that at home. The operator asks, "Do your parents know you're calling long distance?" The words come out not in a Yankee drawl but in a slightly Frenchified tones of someone who grew up in this part of the world, where Latourneau and Bissonnet are more common than Smith or Jones. The tight wad French, Pete's dad called them, and now he has got one on the telephone. God help him. "They let me make toll calls if I pay the charges," Jonesy says, and boy, he should have known that he would end up being the one to actually make it. He rakes down the zipper of his jacket. God, but it's boiling in here. How those old geezers can sit around the stove like they're doing is more than Jonesy can understand. His own friends are pressing in close around him, which is probably understandable. They want to know how things go, but still Jonesy wishes they would step back a little. Having them so close makes them feel even hotter. And if I were to call them Morphees, your mere repair, they stay the same. "Sure," Jonesy says. Sweat runs into one of his eyes, stinging, and he wipes it away like a tear. "My father's at work, but my mom should be home. 949-6658. Only I wish you'd make it quick because I'll just ring to your party," she says, sounding disappointed. Jonesy slips out of his coat, switching the phone from one ear to the other in order to accomplish this, and lets it puddle around his feet. The others are still wearing theirs. Beeve, in fact, hasn't even unzipped his Fonzie jacket. How they can stand it is beyond Jonesy. Even the smells are getting to him. The mustard roll and beans and flour oil and coffee and brine from the pickle barrel. Usually he likes the smells in Gosselin's, but today they make Jonesy feel like blowing chunks. Connections click in his ear. So slow. His friends pushing in too close to the payphone on the back wall, crowding him. 2 or 3 aisles over, Lamar is looking fixedly at the cereal shelf and rubbing his forehead like a man with a severe headache. Considering how much beer he put away last night, Jonesy thinks a headache would be natural. He is coming down with a headache himself, one that beer has nothing to do with. It's so gosh damn hot in here. He straightens up a little. "Ringing," he says to his friends, and immediately wishes he'd keep his mouth shut because they lean in closer than ever. Pete's breath is fucking awful, and Jonesy thinks, what do you do, Petesky? Brush him once a year, whether they need it or not? The phone is picked up on the third ring. "Yes, hello. It's Roberta." It's Roberta, but sounding distracted and upset rather than cheery. And she usually does. Not that it's very hard to figure out why. In the background, he can hear Duddits bawling. Jonesy knows that Alfie and Roberta don't feel that crying the way Jonesy and his friends do. They are grown-ups. And he doubts if this has exactly been Mrs. Cavell's favorite morning. Christ, how can it be so hot in here? Why did they load that fucking wood stuff up with this morning? Anyway, plutonium? Come on, who is it? Impatient, which is also completely unlike Mrs. Cavell. If being the mother of a special person like Duddits teaches you anything, she has told the boys on many occasions, it's patience. Not this morning though. This morning she sounds almost pissed off, which is unthinkable. If you're selling something, I can't talk to you. I'm busy right now and... Duddits in the background, trumpeting and wailing. You are busy, all right, Jonesy thinks. He's been going on like that since dawn, and by now, you must be just about out of your sneaker. Henry throws an elbow into Jonesy's side and flicks a hand at him. Go on, hurry up. And although it hurts, the elbow is still a good thing. If she hangs upon him, Jonesy will have to deal with that bitch of an operator again. Miss Cavell, Roberta, It's me, Jonesy." "Jonesy?" He senses her deep relief. She was wanted so badly for Daddy's friends to call if she half believes she is imagining this. "Is it really you?" "Yeah," he says, "me and the other guys." He holds out the telephone. "Hi, Mrs. Cavell," Henry says. "Hey, what's up?" is Pete's contribution. "Hi, beautiful," Beaver says with a goony grin. He has been more or less in love with Roberta from the day they met her. Lamar Clarendon looks over to the sound of his son's voice, winces, then goes back to his contemplation of the Cheerios and shredded wheat. "Go right ahead," Lamar told the Beav when Beaver said they wanted to call Dadits. "Don't know why you'd want to talk to that marine head, but it's your buffalo nickel." When Jonesy puts the phone back to his ear, Roberta Cavell is saying, Get back to Derry. I thought you were hunting up in Kenya or someplace." "We're still up here," Jonesy says. He looks around at his friends and is astounded to see they were hardly sweating at all. A slight sheen on Henry's forehead, a few beads on Pete's upper lip, and that's all, totally Weirdsville. "We just thought, that we'd better call." "You knew?" Her voice was flat, not unfriendly but unquestioning. He pulls up his flannel shirt, fanning it against his chest. "Yeah. There are 1,000 questions most people would ask at this point, probably starting with, 'How did you know?' or 'What in God's name is wrong with him?' But Roberta isn't most people, and she had already had the best part of the month to see how they are with her son. What she says is, 'Hold on, Jonesy, I'll get him.' Jonesy waits. Far off, he can still hear Dadits wailing and Roberta, softer, talking to him, cajoling him to the phone, using what are now magic words in the Cavell household. Jonesy, Beaver, Pete, Henry. The blatting moves closer, and even over the phone, Jonesy can feel it working its way into his head, a blunt knife that digs and gouges instead of cutting. Youch! Dadit's crying makes Henry's elbow seem like a love tap. Meanwhile, the old jungle juice is rolling down his neck in rivers. His eyes fix on two things about the phone. "Please limit all calls to 5 minutes," reads one. "Profanity not tolerated," reads the other. Beneath this, someone has gouged. Who the fuck says so? Then Dadits is on. Those awful bellowing cries, right there in his ear. Jonesy winces against them, but in spite of the pain, it is possible to be mad at Duds. Up here there are 4 altogether. Down there he is one, all alone, and what a strange one he is. God has hurt him and blessed him at the same time. It makes Jonesy giddy just to think of it. "Dadits," he says. "Dadits is us, Jonesy." He hands the phone to Henry. "Hi, Dadits, it's Henry." Henry hands the phone to Pete. "Hi, Duds, it's Pete. Stop crying now, it's all right." Pete hands the phone to Beaver, who looks around, then stretches the phone as far toward the corner as the cord will allow, cupping his hand over the mouthpiece so the old man by the stove, not to mention his own old man of course, won't hear him. He sings the first 2 lines of the lullaby, then he falls quiet, listening. After a moment, he flashes the rest of them a thumb and forefinger circle. Then he hands the phone back to Henry. "Duds, Henry again. It was just a dream, Dadits. It wasn't real, okay? It wasn't real, and it's over. Just..." Henry listens. Jonesy takes the opportunity to strip off his flannel shirt. The t-shirt beneath is soaked right through. There are a billion things in the world Jonesy doesn't know. What kind of link he and his friends share with Dadits, for one. But he knows he can't stay in here in Gosselin's much longer. He feels like he's in the goddamn stove, not just looking at it. Those old farts around the checkerboard must have ice in their bones. Henry is nodding. That's right, like a scary movie. He listens, frowning. "No, you didn't. None of us did. We didn't hurt him. We didn't hurt any of them." And just like that, bingo, Jonesy knows they did. They didn't mean to exactly, but they did. They were scared Richie would make good on his threat to get them. and so they got him first. Pete is holding out his hand and Henry says, "Pete wants to talk to you, Dud." He hands the phone to Pete and Pete is telling Duddits to just forget it, be chilly Willy. They'll be home soon and they all play the game. They'll have fun, they'll have a fucking roll. But in the meantime, Jonesy raises his eyes and sees one of the signs over the telephone has changed. The one on the left still says, "Please limit all calls to 5 minutes." But the one on the right now says, "Why not go outside? It's cooler." And that's a good idea. Such a good idea. No reason not to. Either the Duddit situation is clearly under control. But before he can make his move, Pete is holding the phone out to him and saying, "He wants to talk to you, Jonesy." For a moment, he almost bolts anyway, thinking, to hell with Duddits, to hell with all of them. But these are his friends. Together they all caught the same terrible dream, did something they didn't mean to do. Liar, fucking liar, you meant it, you did. And their eyes hold him where he is, in spite of the heat, which is now clamped around his chest like a suffocating pad. Their eyes insist that he's a part of this and mustn't leave while Duddits is still on the phone. It's not how you play the game. It's our dream and it's not over yet, their eyes insist. Henry's most of all. It's been going on since the day we found him. There behind Tracker Brothers, down on his knees, and all but naked. He sees the line and now we see it too. And although we may perceive it in different ways, part of it will always see the line. We'll see it until the day we die. There's something else in their eyes too, something that will haunt them, all unacknowledged, until the day they die, and cast its shadow over even their happiest days. The fear of what they did in the unremembered part of their shared dream. That's what's keeping them where he is and makes him take the telephone, even though he is sweltering, roasting, fucking melting. "Duddits," he says. Even his voice sounds hot. "It's really okay. I'm gonna let you talk to Henry again. It's super hot in here and I have to get a breath of fresh..." Duddits interrupts him, his voice strong and urgent. They have always understood his gabble from the very first, and Jonesy understands it now. "Don't go out, Jonesy. Don't go out. Gray, Gray, Mr. Gray." Jonesy's mouth drops open. He looks past the heat-shimmering stove, down the aisle where Beaver's hungover father is now making a listless examination of the canned beans, past Mrs. Gosselin at the old scrolled cash register, and out the front window. That window is dirty and it's filled with signs advertising everything from Winston cigarettes and Moosehead ale to church suppers and 4th of July picnics that happened back when Peanut Farmer was still president. But there's still enough glass for him to look through and see the thing that's waiting for him outside. It's the thing that's came up behind him while he was trying to hold the bathroom door closed. The thing that had snatched his body. A naked grey figure standing beside the Citgo pump on his toeless feet, staring at him with its black eyes. And Jonesy thinks, it's not how they really are, it's just the way we see them. As if to emphasize this, Mr. Gray raises one of his hands and brings it down. From the tips of his 3 fingers, little specks of reddish gold float upward like thistle. Byrus, Jonesy thinks. As if it were a magic word in a fairy tale, everything freezes. Gosselin's market becomes a still life. Then the color drains out of it and it becomes a sepia-toned photograph. His friends were growing transparent and fading before his eyes. Only 2 things seem real. The heavy black receiver of the payphone and the heat. The stifling heat. "Hey, Duddits cries into his ear. Jonesy hears a long, choking intake of breath, which he remembers so well. It is Duddits readying himself to speak as clearly as he possibly can. "Onzy! Ache! Wake up! Wake up, Jonesy! Wake up! Jonesy raised his head and for a moment could see nothing. His hair, heavy and sweat-clotted, hung in his eyes. He brushed it away, hoping for his own bedroom, either the one at Hole in the Wall or even better, the one back home in Brookline, but no such luck. He was still in the office at Tracker Brothers. He'd fallen asleep at the desk and had dreamed of how they had called Duddits all those years ago. That had been real enough, but not the stuporous heat. If anything, Old Man Gosselin had always kept this place cold. He was chintzy that way. The heat had crept into his dream because it was hot in here. Christ, it had to be 100 degrees, maybe 110. Furnace has gone nuts, he thought, and got up. Or maybe the place is on fire. Either way, I have to get out before I roast. Jonesy went around the desk, barely registering the fact that the desk had changed, barely registering the feel of something brushing the top of his head as he hurried toward the door. He was reaching out for the knob with one hand and the lock with the other, and when he remembered Duddits in the dream telling him not to go out, Mr. Gray was out there waiting. And he was, right outside the door, waiting in the storehouse of memories, to which he now had total access. Jonesy spread his sweaty fingers on the wood of the door. His hair fell down over his eyes. His hair fell down over his eyes again, but he barely noticed. "Mr. Gray," he whispered. "Are you out there? You are, aren't you?" No response, but Mr. Gray was all right. He was standing with his hairless rudiment of head cocked and his glass-black eyes fixed on the doorknob, waiting for it to turn, waiting for Jonesy to come bursting out, and then... Goodbye annoying human thoughts. Goodbye distracting and disturbing human emotions. Goodbye, Jonesy. "Mr. Gray, are you trying to smoke me out?" Still no answer. Jonesy didn't need one. Mr. Gray had access to all the controls, didn't he? Including the one that controlled his temperature. How high had he pushed it? Jonesy didn't know, but he knew it was still going up. The band around his chest was hotter and heavier than ever, and he could hardly breathe. His temples were pounding. The window! What about the window? Feeling a burst of hope, Jonesy turned in that direction, putting his back to the door. The window was dark now. So much for the eternal afternoon in October of 1978. And the driveway, which ran up the side of the Tracker Brothers, was buried under shifting drifts of snow. Never, even as a child, had snow looked so inviting to Jonesy. He saw himself bursting through the window like Errol Flynn in some old pirate movie. Saw himself charging into the snow and then throwing himself into it, bathing his burning face in his blessed white chill. Yes, and then the feel of Mr. Gray's hand closing around his neck. Those hands only had 3 digits each, but they could be strong and they could choke the life out of him in no time. If he had cracked the window, tried to let in some of the cold night air, Mr. Gray would be in and battening on him like a vampire. Because that part of Jonesy world wasn't safe. That part was conquered territory. Hobson's choice, fucked either way. "Come out!" Mr. Gray at last spoke through the door and in Jonesy's own voice. "I'll make it quick. You don't want to roast in here, or do you?" Jonesy suddenly saw the desk standing in front of the window. The desk that hadn't even been there when he first found himself in this room. Before he had fallen asleep, it had just been a plain wooden thing, the sort of bottom-of-the-line model you might buy at Office Depot if you were on a budget. At some point, he couldn't remember exactly when, it had gained a phone, just a plain black phone, a utilitarian and undecorative as the desk itself. Now he saw the desk was an oak roll-top, the twin of the one in his Brookline study, and the phone was a blue trimline, like the one in his office at J. He wiped a palmful of piss-warm sweat off his forehead and as he did, he saw what he had brushed with the top of his head. It was the Dreamcatcher from Hole in the Wall. "Holy shit," he whispered. "I'm decorating this place." Of course he was. Why not? Didn't even prisoners on death row decorate their cells? And if he could add a desk and a Dreamcatcher and a trimline phone in his sleep, then maybe. Jonesy closed his eyes and concentrated. He tried to call up an image of his study in Brookline. For a moment, this gave him trouble because a question intruded. If his memories were out here, how could he still have them in here? The answer, he realized, was probably simple. His memories were still in his head, where they had always been. The cartons in the storeroom were what Henry might call an externalization, his way of visualizing all the stuff to which Mr. Gray had access. Never mind. Pay attention to what needs doing. The study in Brookline. See the study in Brookline. "What are you doing?" Mr. Gray demanded. The smarmy self-confidence had left his voice. "What the doodly fuck are you doing?" Jonesy smiled a little at that. He couldn't help it. But he held onto his image. Not just the study, but one wall of the study. Thereby, the door leading into the half bath. Yes, there it was, the Honeywell thermostat. And what was he supposed to say? Was there a magic word? Something like Alakazam? Yeah. With his eyes still closed and a trace of smile still on his sweat-streaming face, Jonesy whispered, "Turrets!" He opened his eyes and looked at the dusty, nondescript wall. The thermostat was there. "Stop it!" Mr. Gray shouted, and even as Jonesy crossed the room, he was amazed by the familiarity in that voice. It was like listening to one of his own infrequent tantrums. The wild disorder of the kids' room was likely Flashpoint on a tape recorder. "You just stop it. This has got to stop." "Kiss my bender, beautiful," Jonesy replied and grinned. How many times had his kids wished they could say something like that to him when he started quacking? Then a nasty thought occurred to him. He'd probably never seen the inside of Brookline Duplay again. But if he did, it would be through eyes which now belonged to Mr. Gray. The cheek the kids kissed, "Ew, scratchy, Daddy," Misha would say, would now be Mr. Gray's cheek. The lips Carla kissed would likewise be Mr. Gray's. And in bed, when she gripped him and guided him into her. Jonesy shivered and then reached for the thermostat, which he saw was set to 120. The only one in the world that went so high, no doubt. He backed it half a turn to left, not knowing what to expect, and was delighted to feel an immediate waft of cool air on his cheeks and brow. He turned his face gratefully up to catch the breeze more fully, and saw a heating-cooling grate set high in one wall. One more fresh touch. "How are you doing that?" Mr. Gray shouted through the door. "Why doesn't your body incorporate the Byrus? How can you be there at all?" Jonesy burst out laughing. There was simply no way to hold it in. "Stop that," Mr. Gray said, and now his voice was chilly. This was the voice Jonesy had used when he had given Carla his ultimatum. "Rehab or divorce, hon. You choose. I can do more than just turn up the heat, you know. I can burn you out or make you blind yourself." Jonesy remembered the pen going into Andy Janus's eye, that terrible thick popping sound, and winced. Yet he recognized a bluff when he heard one. "You're the last and I'm your delivery system," Jonesy thought. "You won't beat the machinery up too much, not until your mission's accomplished anyhow." He walked slowly back to the door, reminding himself to be wary, because as Gollum had said to Bilbo Baggins, it was tricksy, precious, very tricksy. "Mr. Gray?" he asked softly. No answer. "Mr. Gray, what do you look like now? What do you look like when you're yourself?" a little less grey and a little more pink? A couple more fingers on your hands? A little bit of hair on your head? Starting to get some toesies and some testes? No answer. Starting to look like me, Mr. Grey, to think like me. You don't like that, right? Or do you? Still no answer, and Jonesy realized Mr. Grey was gone. He turned and hurried across the window, aware of even more changes. A Currier and Eves woodcut on one wall, a Van Gogh print on another, marigolds, a Christmas gift from Henry, and on his desk, the magic 8-ball he kept on his desk at home. Jonesy barely noticed these things. He wanted to see what Mr. Grey was up to. What had engaged his attention now? For one thing, the interior of the truck had changed. Instead of olive drab plainness of anti-Genesis government issue pickup, clipboard of papers and forms on the passenger side, squawking radio beneath the dash, he was now in a luxury Dodge Ram with a club cab, grey Whaler seats, and roughly as many controls as a Learjet. On the glove compartment was a sticker reading, "I love my border collie." The border collie in question was still present and accounted for, asleep in the passenger side footwell with his tail curled neatly around it. It was a male named Lad. Jonesy sensed that he could access the name and the fate of Lad's master, but why would he want to? Somewhere north of their present position, Janus's army truck was now off the road, and the driver of this one would be lying nearby. Jonesy had no idea why the dog had been spared. The lad lifted his tail and farted, and Jonesy did. He discovered, by looking out of the Tracker Brothers' office window and concentrating, he could look out through his own eyes. The snow was coming down more heavily than ever. But like the army truck, the Dodge was equipped with 4-wheel drive, and it poked through steadily enough. Going the other way, north towards Jefferson Tract, was a chain of headlights set high off the road. Army convoy trucks. Then ahead on this side, a reflectorized sign. White letters, green background, loomed out of the flying snow. Derry, next 5 exits. The city plows had been out, and although there was hardly any traffic, there wouldn't have been much at this hour, even on a clear night. The turnpike was in passable shape. Mr. Grey increased the Ram's speed to 40 miles an hour. They passed 3 exits Jonesy knew well from his childhood: Kansas Street, Airport, Up Mile Hill, Strawford Park, then slowed. Suddenly, Jonesy thought he understood. He looked at the boxes he had dragged in here. Most marked Duddits, a few marked Derry. The latter ones he had taken as an afterthought. Mr. Grey thought he still had the memories he needed, the information he needed. But if Jonesy was right about where they were going, and it made perfect sense, Mr. Grey was in for a surprise. Jonesy didn't know whether to be glad or afraid, and found he was both. Here was a green sign reading Exit 25, Witcham Street. His hand flicked on the Ram's turn signal. At the top of the ramp, he turned left into Witcham, then left again half a mile later into Carter Street. Carter went up at steep angle, heading back towards Up Mile Hill and Kansas Street on the other side of what had once been a high wooded ridge and the site of thriving Micmac Indian village. The street hadn't been plowed in several hours, but the 4-wheel drive was up to the task. The Ram threaded its way among the snow-covered humps on either side, cars that had been street parked in defiance of municipal snow emergency regulations. Halfway up, Mr. Grey turned again, this time onto an even narrower track called Carter Lookout. The Ram skidded its rear end fishtailing, and Lad looked up briefly, whined, then put his nose back onto the floor mat as the tires took hold, biting into the snow and pulling the Ram the rest of the way up. Jonesy stood at his window on the world, fascinated, waiting for Mr. Gray to discover. At first, Mr. Gray wasn't dismayed when the ram's high beams showed nothing at the crest but more swirling snow. He was confident he'd see it in few seconds. Of course he would. Just a few more seconds and he'd see the big white tower which stood here, overlooking the drop to Kansas Street. The tower with the windows marching around it in a rising spiral. In a few more seconds, the ram had chewed his way to the top of what had once been called Standpipe Hill. Here, Carter Lookout, 3 or 4 other similar little lanes ended in a large open circle. They had come to the highest, most open spot in Derry. The wind howled like a banshee, a steady 50 miles an hour with gusts up to 70 and even 80. In the ram's high beams, the snow flew horizontally, a storm of daggers. Mr. Gray sat motionless. Jonesy's hand slid off the wheel and clumped to the either side of Jonesy's body like birds shot out of the sky. At last he muttered, "Where is it?" His left hand rose, fumbled at the door handle, at last pulled it up. He swung a leg out, then fell to Jonesy's knees in a snowdrift as the howling wind snatched the door out of his hand. He got up again and floundered around to the front of the truck, his jacket rippling around him and legs of his jeans snapping like snails in a gale. The wind chill was well below zero. In the Tracker Brothers' office, the temperature went from cool to cold in a space for a few seconds. But the red-black cloud, which now inhabited most of Jonesy's brain and drove Jonesy's body, could have not cared less. "Where is it?" Mr. Gray screamed into the howling mouth of the storm. "Where is the fucking standpipe?" There was no need for Jonesy to shout. Storm or no storm, Mr. Gray would hear even a whisper. "Mr. Gray," he said. "Hardy fucking ha, looks like the joke's on you. The standpipe's been gone since 1985. Jonesy thought that if Mr. Gray had remained still, he would have done a full-fledged preschooler's tantrum. Perhaps right down to the rolling around in the snow and the kicking of the feet. In spite of his best efforts not to, Mr. Gray was binging on Jonesy's emotional chemistry set, as helpless to stop now that he had started as an alcoholic with a key to McDougall's bar. Instead of throwing a fit or having a snit, he thrust Jonesy's body across the bald top of the hill and toward the squat stone pedestal that stood where he had expected to find the storage facility for the city's drinking water. 700,000 gallons of it. Fell in the snow, floundered back up, limped forward on Jonesy's bad hip, fell again and got up again, all the time spitting Beaver's litany of childish curses into the gale. "Doodly fuck, kiss my bender, munch my meat, bite my bag, shit in your fucking hat and wear it backward, Bruce." Coming from Beaver or Henry or Pete, these were always been amusing. Here on this deserted hill, screamed into the teeth of the storm by this lunging, falling monster that looked like a human being, they were awful. Whatever Mr. Gray was, at last reached the pedestal, which stood out clearly enough in the glow cast by the ram's headlights. It had been built to a child's height, about 5 feet, and of the plain rock which had shaped so many New England stone walls. On top were 2 figures cast in bronze, a boy and a girl with their hands linked and their heads lowered as if in a prayer or in grief. The pedestal was drifted to most of its height in snow, but the top of the plug, screwed to the front, was visible. Mr. Gray fell to Jonesy's knees, scraped snow away, and read this. To those lost in the storm, May 31st, 1985. And to the children, all the children, love from Bill, Ben, Bev, Eddie, Richie, Stan, Mike, the Losers Club. Spray painted across it, in jagged red letters, also perfectly visible in truck's headlights, was this further message. Pennywise lives. Mr. Gray knelt looking at this for nearly 5 minutes, ignoring the creepy numbness in Jonesy's extremities. And why would he take care? Jonesy was just your basic rental job. Drive it as hard as you want and butt out your cigarettes on the floor mat. He was trying to make sense of it. Storm, children, losers. Who and what was Pennywise? Most of all, where was the standpipe, which Jonesy's memories had insisted was here? At last he got up, limped back to the truck, got in and turned up the heater. In the blast of hot air, Jonesy's body began to shake. Soon enough, Mr. Gray was back in the locked door of office, demanding an explanation. "Why do you sound so angry?" Jonesy asked mildly, but he was smiling. Could Mr. Gray sense that? "Did you expect me to help you?" "Come on, pal. I don't know the specifics, but I have a pretty good idea what the overall plan is. 20 years from now and the whole planet is one big red-headed ball, right? No more hole in the ozone layer, but no more people either." "Don't you smart-ass me, don't you dare!" Jonesy fought back the temptation to taunt Mr. Gray into another tantrum. He didn't believe his unwelcome guest would be capable of huffing down the door between them, no matter how angry he became. And what sense was there in putting that idea to the test? And besides, Jonesy was emotionally exhausted, his nerves jumping, and his mouth full of a burnt copper taste. How can it not be here? Mr. Gray brought one hand down on the center of the steering wheel. The horn honked. "Lad!" The border collie raised his head and looked at the man behind the wheel with large, nervous eyes. "You can't lie to me. I have your memories." "Well, I did get a few, remember?" "Which ones? Tell me." "Why should I?" Jonesy asked. "What'll you do for me?" Mr. Gray fell silent. Jonesy felt him accessing various files. Then suddenly, smells began to waft into the room from under the door through the heating and cooling vent. They were his favorite aromas: popcorn, coffee, his mother's fish chowder. His stomach immediately began to roar. "Of course I can promise you your mother's chowder," Mr. Gray said, "but I'll feed you, and you're hungry, aren't you?" "With you driving my body and pigging out on my emotions, it'll be a wonder if I wasn't," Jonesy replied. "There is a place south of here, Dysart's. According to you, it's open 24 hours a day, which is a way of saying all the time, or are you lying about that too?" "I never lied," Jonesy replied. "But as you said, I can't. You've got the controls and you've got the memory banks. You got everything, but what's in here?" "Where is there? How can there be a there?" "I don't know," Jonesy said truthfully. "How do I know? You'll feed me?" "Because I have to," Mr. Gray said from his side of the door. And Jonesy realized Mr. Gray was also being truthful. If you hadn't poured gas into the machine from time to time, the machine stopped running. But if you satisfy my curiosity, I'll feed you the things you like. If you don't, the smells from under the door changed, became the greenly assaultive odor of broccoli and Brussels sprouts. "All right," Jonesy said. "I'll tell you what I can, and you feed me pancakes and bacon at Dysart's. Breakfast 24 hours a day, you know. Deal?" "Deal. Open the door and we'll shake on it." Jonesy was surprised into a smile. It was Mr. Gray's first attempt at humor, and really not such a bad one. He glanced into the rearview mirror and saw an identical smile on the mouth which was no longer his. That was a little creepy. "Maybe we'll skip the handshake part," he said. "Tell me." "Yes, but a word of warning. Break a promise to me, and you'll never get to make another one." The truck sat at the top of the standpipe hill, rocking slightly on its springs, its headlamps blazing out cylinders of snow-filled light. And Jonesy told Mr. Gray what he knew. It was, he thought, the perfect place for a scary story. In the years of 1984 and 85 were bad ones in Derry. In the summer of 1984, 3 local teenagers had thrown a gay man into the canal, killing him. In the 10 months which followed, Half a dozen children had been murdered, apparently by a psychotic who sometimes masqueraded as a clown. "Who is this John Wayne Gacy?" Mr. Gray asked. "Was he the one who killed the children?" "No, just someone from the Midwest who had a similar modus operandi," Jonesy said. "You don't understand many of the cross connections my mind makes, do you? Bet there aren't many poets out there where you come from." Mr. Gray made no reply to this. Jonesy doubted if he knew what a poet was or cared. "In any case," Jonesy said, "the last bad thing to happen was a kind of a freak hurricane. It hit on May 31st, 1985. Over 60 people died. The standpipe blew over. It rolled down that hill into Kansas Street." He pointed to the right of the truck, where the land sloped sharply away into the dark. "Almost 3/4 of 1,000,000 gallons of water ran down up Mile Hill, then into downtown, which more or less collapsed. I was in college by then. The storm happened during my finals week. My dad called and told me about it, but of course I knew. It was national news." Jonesy paused, thinking, looking around the office, which was no longer bare and dirty but nicely furnished. His subconscious had added both a couch that he had at home and an Ames chair he had seen in the Museum of Modern Art catalog, lovely but out of his financial reach. And really quite pleasant, certainly nicer than the blizzardly world his body's usurper was currently having to deal with. Henry was in school too, Howard. Pete was bumming around the West Coast, doing his hippie thing. Beaver was trying a junior college downstate, majoring in hashish and video games, is what he said later. Only Derritts had been here in Derry when the big storm blew through, but Jonesy discovered he didn't want to speak Derritt's name. Mr. Gray said nothing, but Jonesy got a clear sense of his impatience. Mr. Gray cared only about the standpipe and how Jonesy had fooled him. "Listen, Mr. Gray, if there was any fooling around, you did it to yourself. I got a few of dairy boxes, that's all, and brought them in here while you were busy killing that poor soldier. The poor soldiers came in ships from the sky and massacred all my kind that they could find. Spare me, you guys didn't come here to welcome us into the galactic book circle. Would things have been any different if we had? You can also spare me the hypotheticals," Jonesy said. "After what you did with Pete and the army guy, I would care less about having an intellectual discussion with you. We do what we have to do. That might be, but if you expect me to help you, you're mad." The dog was looking at Jonesy with even more unease, apparently not used to masters who had held animated conversations with themselves. The standpipe fell over in 1985, 16 years ago, but you stole his memory. Basically, yeah, although I don't think you'd have much luck with that in the court of law, since the memories were mine to begin with. What else have you stolen? That's for me to know and you to think about." There was a hard and ill-tempered thump at the door. Jonesy was once more reminded of the story about the 3 little pigs. Huff and puff, Mr. Gray, enjoy the dubious pleasures of rage. But Mr. Gray had apparently left the door. "Mr. Gray," Jonesy called. "Hey, don't go away mad, okay?" Jonesy guessed that Mr. Gray might be off to another information search. The standpipe was gone, but Derry was still here. Ergo, the town's water had to be coming from somewhere. Did Jonesy know the location of that somewhere? Jonesy didn't. He had a vague memory of drinking a lot of bottled water after coming back from college for the summer, but that was all. Eventually, water had started coming out of their taps again. But what was that to a 21-year-old whose biggest concern had been to get into Mary Shrad's pants? The water came, you drank it. You didn't worry about where it came from as long as it didn't give you the heaves or the squitters. A sense of frustration from Mr. Gray? Or was that just his imagination? Jonesy most sincerely hoped not. This had been a good one. What the 4 of them, in the days of their misspent youth, would undoubtedly have called a fucking pisser. Roberta Cavell woke up from some unpleasant dream and looked to her right, half expecting to see only darkness. But the comforting blue numbers were still glowing from the clock by her bed, so the power hadn't gone out. That was pretty amazing, considering the way the wind was blowing. 1:04 a.m., the blue numbers said. Roberta turned down the bedside lamp. Might as well use it while she could, and drank some water from her glass. Was it the wind that had awakened her? A bad dream? It had been bad, all right. Something about aliens with death rays and everyone running, but she didn't think that was it either. Then the wind stopped and she heard what had waked her. Duddit's voice from downstairs. Duddit's singing? Was that possible? She didn't even know how, considering the terrible afternoon and evening the two of them had put in. Ear! For most of the houses between 2 and 5. Beaver's dead. Duddit's seemingly inconsolable, finally bringing on a nosebleed. She feared these. When Duddit started bleeding, it was sometimes impossible to get him stopped without taking him to the hospital. This time she had been able to stop it by pushing cotton wads into his nostrils and then pinching his nose high up between the eyes. She had called Dr. Briscoe to ask if she could give Duddits one of the yellow Valium tablets, but Dr. Briscoe was off to Nassau, if you please. Some other doctor was on call, some white-coat Johnny who had never seen Duddits in his life, and Roberta didn't even bother to call him. She just gave Duddits the Valium, painted his poor dry lips and the inside of his mouth with one of the lemon-flavored glycerine swabs that he liked. The inside of his mouth was always developing cankers and ulcers. Even when the chemo was over, these persisted. The chemo was over. None of the doctors, not Briscoe, not any of them would admit it. And so the plaster catheter stayed in, but it was over. Roberta would not let them put her boy through that hell again. Once he had taken his pill, she got in bed with him, held him, being careful on his left side, where the indwelling catheter hid under the bandage, and sang to him. Not Beaver's lullaby, though, not today. At last he had begun to quiet, and when she thought he was asleep, she had gently pulled the cotton wads from his nostrils. The second one stuck a little, and Duddit's eyes had opened, that beautiful flash of green. His eyes were his true gift, she sometimes thought, and not that other business, seeing the line and all that went with it. Uma? Yes, Daddy. Ear in N? She felt such sorrow at that, at the thought of Beaver's absurd leather jacket, which he had loved so much and finally worn to tatters. If it had been someone else, anyone else but one of his 4 childhood friends, she would have doubted Daddy's premonition. But if Duddits said Beaver was dead, then Beaver almost certainly was. Yes, honey, I'm sure he is in heaven. Now go to sleep. For another long moment, those green eyes had looked into hers, and she thought he would start crying again. Indeed, one tear, large and perfect, did roll down his stubbly cheek. It was so hard for him to shave now. Sometimes even the Norelco started little cuts that dribbled for hours. Then his eyes had closed again, and she had tiptoed out. After dark, while she was making him oatmeal, all but the blandest foods were now apt to set off vomiting, another sign that the end was nearing. The whole nightmare started again. Terrified already by the increasingly strange news coming out of the Jefferson tract, she had raced back to his room with her heart hammering. Duddits was sitting upright again, whipping his head from side to side in child's gesture of negation. The nosebleed had restarted, and at each jerk of his head, scarlet drops flew. They splattered his pillowcase. His signed photograph of Austin Powers, "Groovy, baby," was written across the bottom, and the bottles on the table, mouthwash, Compazine, Percocet, the multivitamins that seemed to do absolutely no good, the tall jar of lemon swabs. This time it was Pete, he claimed was dead. Sweet and not terribly bright. Peter Moore. Dear God, could it be true? Any of it? All of it? The second bout of hysterical grief hadn't gone as long, probably because Duddits was already exhausted from the first. She had gotten the nosebleed stanched again, lucky her, and had changed his bed, first helping him to his chair by the window. There he had sat, looking out into the renewing storm, occasionally sobbing, sometimes heaving great, watery sighs that hurt her inside. Just looking at him hurt her. How thin he was, how pale he was, how bald he was. She gave him his Red Sox hat, signed across the visor by the great Pedro Martinez. You get so many nice things when you are dying, she sometimes mused, thinking his head would be cold there, so close to the glass, but for once Duddits wouldn't put it on. He only held it on his lap and looked out into the dark, his eyes big and unhappy. At last she had gotten him back into the bed, where once again her son's green eyes looked up at her with all terrible dying brilliance. "Eat in hand, oh!" I'm sure he is. She hadn't wanted to cry, desperately hadn't wanted to. It might set him off again, but she could feel the tears brimming. Her head was pregnant with them, and the inside of her nose tasted the sea each time she pulled in breath. "In N with ear?" "Yes, honey." "I in ear and eat in N?" "Yes, you will. Of course you will. But not for a long while." His eyes had closed. Roberta had sat beside him on the bed, looking down at her hands, feeling sadder than sad, more alone than lonely. Now she hurried downstairs, and yes, it was singing all right, because she spoke such fluent Duddits, and why not? It had been her second language for over 30 years. She translated the rolling syllables without even thinking about them. "Scooby-Dooby-Doo, where are you? We got some work to do now. I've been telling you, Scooby-Doo, we need a helping hand now." She went into the room, not knowing what to expect. Certainly not what she found. Every light blazing, Duddits fully dressed for the first time since his last and very likely final, according to Dr. Briscoe's, remission. He had put on his favorite corduroy pants, his down vest over his Grinch t-shirt, and his Red Sox hat. He was sitting in his chair by the window and looking out into the night. No frowns now, no tears either. He looked out into the storm with a bright-eyed eagerness that took her back to long before the disease, which had announced itself in such stealthy, easy-to-overlook symptoms. How tired and out of breath he got after just a short game of frisbee in the backyard. How big the bruises were from even little thumps and bumps, and how slowly they faded. This was the way he used to look when... But she couldn't think. She was too flustered to think. Daddy, what? "Oh, Ma, Mama, where's my lunchbox?" "In the kitchen." "But Daddy, it's the middle of the night. It's snowing. You aren't..." Going anywhere was the way that one ended, of course, but the words wouldn't cross her tongue. His eyes were so brilliant, so alive. Perhaps she should have been glad to see the light so strongly in his eyes, that energy, but instead she was terrified. "I eat, I lunch." "I need my lunchbox. I need my lunch." "No, Duddits," trying to be firm. "You need to take off your clothes and get back into bed. That's what you need, and all you need. Here, I'll help you." But when she approached, he raised his arms and crossed them across his narrow chest. The palm of his right hand pressed against his left cheek, the palm of his left against the right cheek. From the earliest childhood, it was all he could muster in the way of defiance. It was usually enough, and it was now. She didn't want to upset him again. perhaps start another nosebleed, but she wasn't going to put up a lunch for him in his Scooby-Doo lunchbox at 1:15 in the morning. Absolutely not. She retreated to the side of the bed and sat down on it. The room was warm, but she was cold, even in her heavy flannel nightgown. Duddits slowly lowered his arms, watching her warily. "You can sit up if you want," she said. "But why? Did you have a dream, Daddy? A bad one?" Maybe a dream, but not a bad one. Not with that eager look on his face, and now she recognized it well enough. It was the way he had looked so often back in the 80s. In the good years before Henry, Pete, Beaver, and Jonesy had all gone their separate ways, calling less frequently and coming by to see him less frequently, as they raced towards their grown-up lives and forgot the one who had stayed behind. It was the look he got when his special sense told him that his friends were coming by to play. Sometimes they'd all go off together to Strawford Park or the Barrens. They weren't supposed to go there, but they did. Both she and Alfie had known that they did, and one of their trips there had gotten them all on the front page of the newspaper. Sometimes Alfie and one of their moms or dads would take them to Airport Mini Golf or Fun Town in Newport. Or one of those days, she would always pack Duddits, sandwiches and cookies, and a thermos of milk in his Scooby-Doo lunchbox. He thinks his friends are coming. It must be Henry and Jonesy he's thinking of. But he says Pete and Beeve. Suddenly, a terrible image came to her as she sat on Duddit's bed, with her hands folded in her lap. She saw herself opening the door to a knock that came at an empty hour of 3 in the morning, not wanting to open it, but helpless to stop herself. And the dead ones were there, instead of the living ones. Beaver and Pete were there, returned to the childhood in which they had been living on the day she had first met them. The day they had saved Duddy from God knew what nasty trick and then brought him home safe. In her mind's eye, Beaver was wearing his many-zippered motorcycle jacket and Pete was wearing the crewneck sweater, of which he had been so proud, the one with NASA on the left breast. She saw them cold and pale, their eyes the lusterless grey-black glaze of corpses. She saw Beaver step forward. No smile for her now, no recognition of her now. When Joe Beaver Clarendon put out his pallid, starfish hands, he was all business. "We come for Duddits, Mrs. Cavell. We dead, and now he is too." She clasped her hands tighter as a shudder twisted through her body. Duddits didn't see. He was looking out of the window again, his face eager and expectant, and very softly he began to sing again. "Ooby, ooby, ooh, ah, ah, ooh, e, a, ooh, 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 ow." "Mr. Gray!" No answer. Jonesy stood at the door of what was now most definitely his office. Not a trace of Tracker Brothers left, except for the dirt on the windows. The matter-of-fact pornography of the girl with her skirt raised had been replaced by Van Gogh's marigolds. Feeling more and more uneasy. What was the bastard looking for? "Mr. Gray, where are you?" No answer this time either. But there was a sense of Mr. Gray returning, and he was happy. The son of a bitch was happy. Jonesy didn't like that at all. "Listen," Jonesy said, hands still pressed to the door of the sanctuary, forehead now pressed to it as well. "Got a proposal for you, my friend. You're halfway human already. Why not just go native? We can coexist, I guess. I'll show you around. Ice cream's good, beer's even better. What do you say?" He suspected Mr. Gray was tempted, as only an essentially formless creature would be tempted when offered form. A trade right out of a fairy tale. Not tempted enough, however. There was a spin of the starter, the roar of the truck's motor. "Where are we going, chum? Always assuming we can get off Standpipe Hill, that is?" No answer, only that disquieting sense that Mr. Gray had been looking for something, and found it. Jonesy hurried across the window and looked out in time to see truck's headlights sweep across the pillar, erected to memorialize the lost. The plaque had drifted in again, which meant they might have been here a while. Slowly, carefully, now pushing its way through the bumper-high drifts, the Dodge Ram started back down the hill. 20 minutes later, they were on the turnpike again. 20 minutes later, they were on the turnpike again, once more headed south. Owen couldn't raise Henry by calling out loud. The man was too deep in exhausted sleep, so he called with his mind. He found it was easier as the Byrus continued to spread. It was growing on 3 of his fingers on his right hand now, and I had all but plugged the cup of the left ear with its spongy, itching growth. He had also lost a couple of teeth, although nothing seemed to be growing in the sockets, at least not yet. Kurtz and Freddy had stayed clean, thanks to Kurtz's finely honed instincts, but the crews of the 2 surviving Blue Boy gunships, Owen's and Joe Blakely's, were lousy with Byrus. Ever since talking to Henry in the shed, Owen had heard the voices of his compatriots, calling to each other across a previously unsuspected void. They were covering up the infection for now, and as he himself was, lots of heavy winter clothing helped. But that wouldn't be possible for much longer, and they didn't know what to do. In that regard, Owen supposed he was lucky. He at least had a wheel to which he could put his shoulder. Standing outside the back of the shed and beyond the electrified wire, smoking another cigarette he didn't want, Owen went in search for Henry and found him working his way down a steep, brushy slope. Above him was the sound of kids playing baseball or softball. Henry was a boy, a teenager, and he was calling someone's name. Janie, Jolie, it didn't matter. He was dreaming, and Owen needed him in the real world. He had let Henry sleep as long as he could, almost an hour longer than he really wanted to. But if they were going to get the show on the road, now was the time. "Henry!" he called. The teenager looked around, startled. There were other boys with him, 4 of them, one peering into some kind of pipe. They were indistinct, hard to see, and Owen didn't care about them anyway. Henry was the one he wanted, and not this pimply, startled version of him either. Owen wanted the man. "Henry, wake up!" "No, she's in there. We have to get her out. I don't give a rat's ass about her, whoever she is. Wake up!" "No, It's time, Henry. Wake up! Wake up! Wake the fuck up!" Henry sat up with a gasp, not sure who or where he was. That was bad, but there was worse. He didn't know when he was. Was he 18 or almost 38 or somewhere in between? He could smell grass, hear the crack of the bat on the ball. A softball bat. It had been girls playing, girls in yellow shirts, and he could still hear Pete screaming, "She's in here, guys! I think she's in here!" Pete saw it. He saw the line. Henry murmured. He didn't know exactly what he was talking about. The dream was already fading. Its bright images were being replaced by something dark, something he had to do or try to do. He smelled hay and more faintly, the sweet sour aroma of pot. "Mister, can you help us?" Big doe eyes. Marsha, her name had been. Things coming into focus now. "Probably not," he answered her. Then added, "But maybe." "Wake up, Henry. It's 3:45. Time to drop your cock and grab your socks." The voice was stronger and more immediate than the others, overwhelming them and dampening them out. It was like a voice from a Walkman when the batteries were fresh and the volume was turned all the way up to 10. Owen Underhill's voice. He was Henry Devlin, and if they were going to try this, the time was now. Henry got up, wincing at the pain in his legs, his back, his shoulders, his neck. Where his muscles weren't screaming, the advancing Byrus was itching abominably. He felt 100 years old until he took the first step toward the dirty window, then decided it was more than 110. Owen saw the man's shape come into view inside the window and nodded, relieved. Henry was moving like Mitsula on a bad day, but Owen had something that could fix that, at least temporarily. He had stolen it from the brand new infirmary, which was so busy no one had noticed him coming or going. All the time he had protected the front of his mind with the 2 blocking mantras Henry had taught him. Ride a cock horse to Banbury Cross, and yes we can, yes we can, yes we can, great gosh almighty. So far they seemed to be working. He'd gotten a few strange looks but no questions. Even the weather continued in their favor, the storm roaring on unabated. But he could see Henry's face at the window, a pale oval blur looking out at him. "I don't know about this," Henry said. "Man, I can hardly walk." "I can help with that. Stand clear of the window." Henry moved back with no questions. In one pocket of his parka, Owen had the small metal box, USMC stamped on the steel top, in which he kept his various IDs when he was on active duty. The box has been present from Kurtz himself after the Santo Domingo mission last year, a fine irony. In another pocket there were 3 rocks which he had picked up from beneath his own helicopter, where the fall of snow was thin. He took one of them, a good-sized chunk of Maine granite, and then paused, appalled, as a bright image filled his mind. Mac Cavanaugh, the fellow from the Blue Boy leader, who had lost 2 of his fingers on the op, was sitting beside one of the semi-trailer boxes in the compound. With him was Frank Belson from Blakey's Blue Boy 3, the other gunship that had made it back to the base. One of them had turned on a powerful 8-cell flashlight and set it on its base like an electric candle. Its bright glow sprayed up into the gloom. This was happening right now, not 500 feet from where Owen stood, with a rock in his hand and his steel box in the other. Cavanaugh and Belson sat side by side on the floor of the trailer. Both wore what looked like heavy red beards. Luxuriant growth had burst apart the bandages over the stumps of Cavanaugh's fingers. They had service automatics, the muzzles in their mouths. Their eyes were linked, so were their minds. Belson was counting down. 5, 4, 3. "Boys, no!" Owen cried, but got no sense when they heard him. The link was too strong, forged into the resolve of men who had made up their minds. They would be the first of Kurtz's command to do this tonight. Owen did not think they would be the last. "Owen?" That was Henry. "Owen, what's—" Then he tapped into what Owen was seeing and fell silent, horrified. 2, 1. 2 pistol shots, muffled by the roar of wind and 4 Zimmer electrical generators. 2 fans of blood and brain tissue, appearing like magic over the heads of Cavanaugh and Belson in the dim light. Owen and Henry saw Belson's right foot give a final dying jump. It struck the barrel of the flashlight, and for a moment they could see Cavanaugh's and Belson's distorted, Byrus-speckled faces. Then, as the flashlight went rolling across the bed of the box, casting cartwheels of light on the aluminum side, the picture went dark, like the picture on the TV when the plug has been pulled. "Christ!" Owen whispered. "Good Christ!" Henry had appeared behind the window again. Owen motioned him back, then threw the rock. The range was short, but his first shot missed anyway, bouncing harmlessly off the weathered boards on the left of the target. He took the second, pulled in a deep settling breath, and threw. This one shattered the glass. "Got mail for you, Henry, coming through." He tossed the steel box through the hole where the glass had been. It bounced across the shed floor. Henry picked the box up and undid the clasp. Inside were 4 foil wrapper packets. "What are these?" "Pocket rockets," Owen returned. "How's your heart?" "Okay, as far as I know." "Good, because that shit makes cocaine feel like Valium. There are 2 in each pack. Take 3, save the rest." "I don't have any water." Owen sent a clear picture. south end of a northbound horse. Chew them, beautiful. You've got a few teeth left, don't you? There was a real anger in this, and at first Henry didn't understand it. But of course he did. If there was anything he could be able to understand this early morning, it was the sudden loss of friends. The pills were white, unmarked by the name of any pharmaceutical company, and terribly bitter in his mouth as they crumbled. Even his throat tried to pucker as he swallowed. The effect was almost instantaneous. By the time he had tucked Owen's USMC box into his pants pocket, Henry's heartbeat had doubled. By the time he stepped back to the window, it had tripled. His eyes seemed to pulse from their sockets with each quick rap in his chest. This wasn't distressing, however. He actually found it quite pleasant. No more sleepiness, and his aches seemed to have flown away. "Yow!" he called. "Popeye should try a few cans of this shit," and laughed, both because speaking now seemed so odd, archaic, almost because he felt so fine. "Keep it down, what do you say?" Okay. Even his thoughts seemed to have acquired a new crystalline force, and Henry didn't think it was just his imagination. Although the light behind the old feed shed was little less than the rest of the compound, it was still strong enough for him to see Owen wince and raise a hand to the side of his head, as if someone had shouted directly into his ear. "Sorry," he said. "It's all right. It's just that you're strong. You must be covered with that shit." "Actually, I'm not," Henry returned. A wink of his dream came back to him. The 4 of them on a grassy slope. No, the 5 of them, because Duddits had been there too. "Henry, do you remember where I said I'd be?" "Southwest corner of the compound, all the way across the barn on the diagonal, but no buts, that's where I'll be. If you want to ride out of here, it's where you better be too. It's..." A pause when Owen checked his watch. If it was still working, it must be the kind you wind up, Henry thought. 2 minutes to 4, I'll give you half an hour. Then if the folks in the barn haven't started to move, I'm going to short the fence. Half an hour away won't be long enough, Henry protested, although he was standing still, looking out as Owen's form in the blowing snow. He was breathing fast, like a man in a race. His heart felt like it was in a race. "It'll have to be," Owen said. "The fence is alarmed. There'll be sirens, even more lights, a general alert. I'll give you 5 minutes, and after this shit starts hitting the fan, there is 300 count, and if you haven't showed up, I'm on my merry way. You'll never find Jonesy without me. That doesn't mean I have to stay here and die with you, Henry." Patient, as if talking to a small child. "If you don't make it to where I am in 5 minutes, there'll be no chance for either of us anyway. Those 2 men who just committed suicide, they're not the only ones who are fucked up." "I know." Henry caught a brief mental glimpse of a yellow school bus with Millie Knockett's school department printed up the side. Looking out of the windows, there were 2 score of grinning skulls. They were Owen Underhill's mates, Henry realized, the ones he had arrived with yesterday morning. Men who were now either dying or already dead. "Never mind them," Owen replied. "It's Kurtz ground support we have to worry about now, especially the Imperial Valleys. If they exist, you better believe they'll follow orders, and that they're well trained. And training wins over confusion every time. That's what training is for. If you stick around, they'll roast you and toast you. 5 minutes is what you have once the alarms go. And 300 count." Owen's logic was hard to like and impossible to refute. "All right," Henry said. 5 minutes. "You had no business doing this in the first place," Owen told him. The thought came to Henry, encrusted with a complex filigree of emotion, frustration, guilt, the inevitable fear. In Owen Underhill's case, of not dying but of failure. If what you say is true, everything depends on whether or not we get out of here clean. For you to maybe put the entire world at risk because of a few hundred schmoes in a barn. It's not the way your boss would do it, right? Owen reacted with surprise. No words, but the kind of a comic book in Henry's mind. Then, over the ceaseless howl and hoot of the wind, he heard Owen laugh. You got me there, beautiful. Anyway, I'll get them moving. I'm a motivational master. I know, you'll try. Henry couldn't see Owen's face, but felt him smiling. Then Owen spoke loud. And after that, tell me again. Why? Maybe because soldiers need motivation too, especially when they are derailing. And belay the telepathy, I want you to say it out loud. I want to hear the word. Henry looked at the man shivering on the other side of the fence and said, After that we are going to be heroes, not because we want to, but because there were no other options. Out in the snow and in the wind, Owen was nodding and still smiling. Why not? He said. Just why the fuck not? In his mind, glimmering, Henry saw the image of a little boy with a plate raised over his head. What the man wanted was for the little boy to put the plate back. That plate that had haunted him so over the years and would forever stay broken. Dreamless since childhood and thus insane, Kurtz woke as he always did, at one moment nowhere, at the next completely awake and cognizant of his surroundings. Alive. Hallelujah. Oh yes, still in the big time. He turned his head and looked at the clock, but the goddamn thing had gone off again in spite of its fancy anti-magnetic casing, flashing 12, 12, 12, like a stutterer caught on one word. He turned on the lamp beside the bed and picked up the pocket watch on the bed table. 4:08. Kurtz put it down again, swung his bare feet out on the floor and stood up. The first thing he became aware of was the wind, still howling like a woe dog. The second was that the faraway mutter of voices in his head had disappeared entirely. The telepathy was gone and Kurtz was glad. It had offended him in an elemental, down-deep way as certain sexual practices offended him. The idea that someone might be able to come into his very head to be able to visit the upper levels of his mind had been horrible. The Grey Boys deserved to be wiped out for that alone, for bringing that disgustingly peculiar gift. Thank God it had proved ephemeral. Kurtz shucked his grey workout shorts and stood naked in front of the mirror on the bedroom door, letting his eyes go up from his feet where the first snarls of purple veins were beginning to show, to the crown of his head, where his greying hair stood up in a sleep tousle. He was 60 but not looking too bad. Those busted veins on the side of his feet were the worst of it. Had a hell of a good crank on them too. Although he had never made much use of it, women were for the most part wild creatures incapable of loyalty. They drained a man. In his secret, insane heart, where even his madness was starched and pressed and fundamentally not very interesting, Kurtz believed all sex was foobar. Even when it was done for procreation, the result was usually a brain-equipped tumor, not much different from the shit weasels. From the crown of his head, Kurtz let his eyes descend again, slowly looking for the least patch of red, the tiniest rosella blush. There was nothing. He turned around, looked at as much as he could by craning back over his shoulders and still saw nothing. He spread his buttocks, probed between them, slid a finger 2 knuckles deep into his anus and felt nothing but flesh. "I'm clean," he said in a low voice as he washed his hand briskly in the Winnebagger's little bathroom. Clean as a whistle. He stepped into his shorts again, then sat on his rack to slip into his socks. Clean. Praise God, clean. A good word, clean. The unpleasant feeling of the telepathy, like sweaty skin pressed against sweaty skin, was gone. He wasn't supporting a single strand of Ripley. He had even checked his tongue and gums. So what had awakened him? Why were there alarm bells clanging in his head? Because telepathy wasn't the only form of extrasensory perception. Because long before the Grey Boys knew there was such a place as Earth, tucked away in this dusty and seldom visited carrel of the great interstellar library, there had been a little thing called instinct, the specialty of uniform-wearing homo saps such as himself. "The hunch," Kurtz said. "The good old all-American hunchola." He put on his pants. Then, still bare-chested, he picked up the walkie which lay on the bedside table beside the pocket watch. 4:16 now, and how the time seemed to be rushing like a brakeless car plunging down the hill toward a busy intersection. The walkie was a special digital job, encrypted and supposedly unjammable. But one look at his supposedly impervious digital clock made him realize none of the gear was on anything. He clicked the send squeal button twice. Freddie Johnson came back quickly and not sounding too sleepy. Oh, now that the crunch time was here, how Kurtz, who had been born Robert Coons, name, what's in a name, longed for Underhill. Owen, he thought. Why did you have to skid just when I needed you the most, son? Boss, I'm moving Imperial Valley up to 6. That's Imperial Valley at 0600. Come back and acknowledge me. He had to just listen to why it was impossible. Crap Owen would not have spouted in his weakest dream. He gave Freddie roughly 40 seconds to vent before saying, "Close your clam, you son of a bitch." Shocked silence from Freddie's end. "You got something brewing here. I don't know what, but it woke me up out of a sound sleep with alarm bells ringing. Now I put you fellows and girls together for a reason, and I expect you to be still drawing breath come supper time. You want to get them moving. Tell Gallagher she may wind up on point. Acknowledge me, Freddie?" "Boss, I acknowledge. One thing you should know, we had 4 suicides that I know of. There might have been more." Kurtz was neither surprised or displeased. Under certain circumstances, suicide wasn't just acceptable but noble, the true gentleman's final act. "From the choppers?" "Affirmative." "No Imperial Valleys?" "No, boss, no valleys." "All right, floor it, Buck. We got trouble. I don't know what it is, but I know it's coming. Big thunder." Kurtz tossed the walkie back on the table and continued dressing. He wanted another cigarette, but they were all gone. The pretty good herd of milkers had once been stabled in Old Man Gosselin's bar. While the interior may have not passed USDA standards as it now stood, the building was still in okay shape. The soldiers had strung some high-wattage bulbs that cast a brilliant glare over the stalls, the milking stations in the parlor, and the upper and lower lofts. They had also put in a number of heaters, and the barn glowed with a pulsing, almost feverish warmth. Henry unzipped his coat as soon as he stepped in, but still felt the sweat break out of his face. He supposed Owen's pills had something to do with that. He had taken another one outside the barn. His first thought as he looked around was how similar the barn was to the various refugee camps he had seen. Bosnian Serbs in Macedonia, Haitian rebels after Uncle Sugar's Marines had landed in Port-au-Prince, the African exiles who had left their home countries because of a disease, famine, civil war, or a combination of all three. You got used to seeing such things on the TV news, but the pictures always came from far away. The horror with which one viewed them was almost clinical. But this wasn't a place he needed a passport to visit. This was the cow barn in New England. The people packed into it weren't wearing rags and dirty dashikis, but parkas from beans, cargo pants so perfect for those extra shotgun shells from Banana Republic, underwear from Fruit of the Loom. The look was the same though. The only difference he could discern was how surprised they all still seemed. This wasn't supposed to be happening in the land of Sprint Nickel Knights. The internees pretty well covered the main floor, where hay had been spread, jackets on top of that. They were sleeping in little clumps or family groups. There were more of them in the lofts, and 3 or 4 to each of the 40 stalls. The room was full of snores and gurgles and the groans of people dreaming badly. Somewhere a child was weeping, and there was a piped-in music. To Henry, this was the final bizarre touch. Right now, the dozing doomed in Old Man Gosselin's barn were listening to Fred Waring's orchestra float through a violin-heavy section of some enchanted evening. Hyped as he was, everything stood out with brilliant, exclamatory clarity. All the orange jackets and hats, he thought. Man, it's Halloween in hell. There was also a fair amount of the red gold stuff. Henry saw patches growing on cheeks and ears between fingers. He also saw patches growing on beams and on the electrical cords of several dangling lights. The predominant smell in here was hay, but Henry had no trouble picking up the smell of sulfur-tinged ethyl alcohol under it. As well as the snows, there was a lot of farting going on. It sounded like 6 or 7 seriously untalented musicians tootling away on tubas and saxophones. Under other circumstances, it would have been funny, or perhaps even to these, to a person who hadn't seen that weasel thing wriggling and snarling on Jonesy's bloody bed. How many of them are incubating those things? Henry wondered. The answer didn't matter. The answer didn't matter, he supposed, because the weasels were ultimately harmless. They might be able to live outside their house in the barn, but outside in the storm, where the wind was blowing a gale and the chill factor was below 0, they wouldn't have a chance. He needed to talk to these people. No, that wasn't right. What he needed to do was scare the living hell out of them. He had to get them moving in spite of the warmth in here and the cold outside. There had been cows in here before. There were cows here again. He had to change them back into people. Scared, pissed off people. He could do it, but not alone, and the clock was ticking. Owen Underhill had given him half an hour. Henry estimated that a third of that was already gone. Got to have a megaphone, he thought. That's step 1. He looked around, spotted a burly, balding man sleeping on his side of the left of the door leading to the milking parlor, and walked over to take a closer look. He thought it was one of the guys he'd kicked out of the shed, but he wasn't sure. When it came to hunters, burly, balding men were a dime a peck. But it was Charles, and the Byrus were rethatching what old Charlie no doubt had referred to as the solar sex panel. Who needs Rogaine when you got this shit going for you? Henry thought, then grinned. Charles was good. Better yet, Marsha was sleeping nearby, holding hands with Darren, Mr. Bomber Joint from Newton. Byrus was now growing on one of Marsha's smooth cheeks. Her husband was still clean, but his brother-in-law, Bill, had that been his name, was lousy with this stuff. Best in show, Henry thought. He knelt by Bill, took his Byrus-speckled hand, and spoke into the tangled jungle of his bad dreams. Wake up, Bill. Wakey, wakey, we have to get out of here, and if you help me, we can. Wake up, Bill. Wake up and be a hero. It happened with a speed that was exhilarating. Henry felt Bill's mind rising towards his, floundering out of the nightmares that had entangled it, reaching for Henry the way a drowning man will reach for the lifeguard who has swum out to save him. Their minds connected like couplers on a pair of freight cars. Don't talk. Don't try to talk, Henry told him. Just hold on. We need Marsha and Charles. 4 of us should be enough. What? No time, Billy. Let's go. Billy took his sister-in-law's hand. Marsha's eyes flashed open at once, almost as if she's been waiting for this, and Henry felt all the dials inside his head turn up another notch. She wasn't supporting as much as growth as Bill, but perhaps had more natural talent. She took Charles' hand without a single question. Henry had an idea. She had already grasped what was going on here and what needed to be done. Thankfully, she also grasped the necessity of speed. They were going to bomb these people, then swing them like a club. Charles sat with a jerk, eyes wide and bulging from their fatty sockets. He got up as if someone had goosed him. Now all four of them were on their feet, hands joined like participants in a séance, which, Henry reflected, thus almost was. "Give it to me," he told them, and they did. The feeling was like having a magic wand placed in his hand. "Listen to me," he called. Heads rose. Some people sat up out of the sound sleeps as if they had been electrified. "Listen to me and boost me. Boost me up. Do you understand? Boost me up. This is your only chance. So boost me up." They did, as instinctively as people whistling a tune or clapping to a beat. If he had given them time to think about it, it probably would have been harder, perhaps even impossible. But he didn't. Most of them had been sleeping, and he caught the infected ones, the telepaths, with their minds wide open. Operating on instinct himself, Henry sent a series of images. Soldiers wearing masks surrounding the barn, most with guns, some with backpacks connected to long wands. He made the faces of the soldiers into editorial page caricatures of cruelty. At an amplified order, the wands unleashed streams of liquid fire, napalm. The sides of the barn and the roof caught at once. Henry shifted to the inside, sending pictures of screaming, milling people. Liquid fire dripped through the holes in the blazing roof and ignited the hay in the lofts. Here was a man with his hair on fire. There was a woman in burning ski parka, still decorated with lift tickets from Sugarloaf and Ragged Mountain. They were all looking at Henry now. Henry and his linked friends. Only the telepaths were receiving the images. But as many as 60% of people in the barn were infected. Even those who weren't caught, their sense of panic. A rising tide lifts all boats. Clamping Bill's hand tightly with one of his own and Marsha's with the other, Henry switched the images back to the outside perspective again. Fire, encircling soldiers, an amplified voice shouting for the soldiers to be sure no one got clear. The detainees were on their feet now, speaking in a rising babble of frightened voices. Except for the deep telepaths, they only stared at him, haunted eyes and Byrus-speckled faces. He showed them the barn burning like a torch in the snowdriver's night, the wind turning an inferno into an explosion, a firestorm, and still the napalm hoses poured it on, and still the amplified voice exhorted, "That's right, men! Get them all! Don't let any of them get away! They are the cancer, and we are the cure!" Imagination fully pumped now, feeding on itself in a kind of frenzy. Henry sent images to few people who managed to find the exits or to wiggle out through the windows. Many of these were in flames. One was a woman with a child cradled in her arms. The soldiers machine-gunned all of them, but the woman and the child, who were turned into napalm candles as they ran. "No!" Several women screamed in unison, and Henry realized with a species of sick wonder that all of them, even those without children, had put their own faces on the burning woman. They were up here now, milling around like cattle in a thunderstorm. They had to move them before they had a chance to think once, let alone twice. Gathering the force of the minds linked to his, Henry sent them an image of the store. "There!" he called to them. "It's your only chance! Through the store if you can. Break down the fence if the door's blocked. Don't stop! Don't hesitate! Get into the woods! Hide in the woods! They are coming to burn this place down, the barn and everyone in it. And the woods are your only chance! Now! Now!" Deep in the well of his own imagination, flying on the pills Owen had given him and sending with all his strength, images of possible safety there, of certain death here. Images as simple as those of Charles' picture book. He was only distantly aware that he had begun chanting aloud. "Now! Now! Now! Marcia Childs picked it up, and then his brother-in-law. Then Charles, the man with the overgrown solar sex panel. Now! 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 Although immune to the virus and thus no more telepathic than the average bear, Darren was not immune to the growing vibe, and he also joined in. Now! 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 It jumped from person to person and to group, a panic-induced infection more catching than the virus. Now! 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 The barn shook with it. Fists were pumping in unison like a fist in a rock concert. Now! 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 Henry let them take it over and build it, pumping his own fist without even realizing it, flinging his hand into the air to the farthest reach of his aching arm, even as he reminded himself not to be caught up in the cyclone of mass mind he had created. When they went north, he was going south. He was waiting for some point of no return to be reached, the point of ignition and spontaneous combustion. It came. Now! He whispered. He gathered Marcia's mind, Bill's, Charlie's, and then the others that were close and particularly locked in. He merged them, compressed them, and then flung a single word like a silver bullet into the minds of the 317 people in Old Man Gosselin's barn. Now! There was a moment of utter silence before Hell's door flew open. Just before dusk, a dozen two-man sentry huts. They were actually porta potties with the urinals and toilet seats yanked out, had been set up at intervals along the security fence. These came equipped with heaters that threw a stuporous glow in the small spaces, and the guards had no interest in going outside them. Every now and then, one of them would open a door to allow a snowy swirl of fresh air, but that was the extent of guards' exposure to the outside world. Most of them were peacetime soldiers with no gut understanding of how high the stakes were, so they swapped stories about sex, cars, postings, sex, their families, their future, sex, drinking and drugging expeditions, and sex. They had missed Owen Underhill's 2 visits to the shed. They would have been clearly visible from both Post 9 and Post 10, and they were the last to be aware that they had a full-scale revolt in their hands. 7 other soldiers, boys who had been with Kurtz a little longer and thus had a little more salt on their skins, were in the back of the store near the wood stove, playing 5-card stud in the same office where Owen had played Kurtz the tapes roughly 2 centuries ago. 6 of the card players were sentries. The 7th was Dog Brodsky's colleague, Gene Cambry. Cambry hadn't been able to sleep. The reason was concealed by a stretchy cotton wristlet. He didn't know how long the wristlet would serve. However, because the red stuff under it was spreading, if he wasn't careful, someone would see it. And then, instead of playing cards in the office, he might be out there in the barn with the John Q's. And would he be the only one? Ray Parsons had a big wad of cotton in one ear. He said it was an earache, but who knew for sure? Ted Trzowski had a bandage on one meaty forearm and claimed he gouged himself stringing compound barbed wire much earlier in the day. Maybe it was true. George Udall, the dog's immediate superior in more normal times, was wearing a knitted cap over his bald head. Damn thing made him look like some kind of an elderly white rapper. Maybe there was nothing under there but skin. But it was warm in here for a cap, wasn't it? Especially a knitted one. Kick a buck, Howie Everett said. Call, said Danny O'Brien. Parsons called and so did Udall. Cambry barely heard. In his mind there rose an image of a woman with a child cradled in her arms. As she struggled across the drifted-in paddock, a soldier turned her into napalm road flare. Cambry winced, horrified, thinking of this image had been served up by his own guilty conscience. Jane? Al Coleman asked. Are you going to call or... What's that? Howie asked, frowning. What's what? Ted Trzowski said. If you listen, you will hear it. Howie replied. Dumb Polak. Cambry heard his unspoken corollary in his head, but paid it no mind. Once it had been called to their attention, the chant was clear enough, rising above the wind, quickly taking on strength and urgency. Now! 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 It was coming from the barn, directly behind them. What in the blue hell? Udall asked in a musing voice, blinked over the folding table with the scatter of cards, ashtrays, chips and money. Jean Cambry suddenly understood that there was nothing under the stupid woolen cap but skin, after all. Udall was nominally in charge of this little group, but he didn't have a clue. He couldn't see the pumping fists, couldn't hear the strong thought-out voice that was leading the chant. Cambry saw alarm on Parsons' face, on Everett's, on Coleman's. They were seeing it too. Understanding leaped among them, while the uninfected ones only looked puzzled. "Fuck is gonna break out," Cambry said. "Don't be stupid, Jean," George Udall said. "They don't know what's coming down. Besides, they are civilians. They are just letting off a little steam." Cambry lost the rest as a single word. "Now!" ripped through his brain like a buzzsaw. Ray Parsons and Al Coleman winced. Howie Everett cried out in pain, his hands going to his temples, his knees connecting with the underside of the table and sending chips and cards everywhere. A dollar bill landed atop the hot stuff and began to burn. "Ah, fuck a duck, look at what you..." Ted began. "They are coming," Cambry said. "They are coming at us!" Parsons, Everett and Coleman lunged for the M4 carbines, leaning beside old man Gosselin's coat rack. The other looked at them, surprised, still 3 steps behind, and then there was a washed thud as 60 or more of the internees struck the barn doors. Those doors had been locked from the outside, big steel locks, army issue. They held, but the old wood gave with the splintering crack. The prisoners charged through the gap, yelling, "Now! Now!" into the snowy mouth of the wind and trampling several of their number underfoot. Cambry also lunged, got one of the compact assault rifles, then snatched out of his hands. "That's mine, mother!" Ted Trezovsky snarled. There was less than 20 yards between the shattered barn doors and back of the store. The mob swept across the gap, shouting, "Now! Now! Now!" The poker table went over with a crash. The perimeter alarm went off as the first internees struck the double-string fence and were either fried or hooked like fish on the oversized bundles of barbs. Moments later, the alarm's honking, pulsing bray was joined by a whooping siren, a general quarters alert which was sometimes referred to as a Situation 666, the end of the world. In the plastic porta-potty sentry huts, surprised and frightened faces peered out dazedly. "The barn!" someone shouted. "Collapse into the barn! It's an escape!" The sentries trotted out into the snow, many of them bootless, moving along the outside of the fence, unaware it had been shotted out by the weight of more than 80 kamikaze deer hunters, all screaming now at the top of their lungs, even as they jittered and fried and died. No one noticed the single man, tall, skinny, wearing a pair of old-fashioned horn-rimmed specs, who left from the back of the barn and set out diagonally across the drifts, filling the paddock. Although Henry could neither see or sense anyone paying attention to him, he began to run. He felt horribly exposed under the brilliant lights, and the cacophony of the siren and the perimeter alarm made him feel panicky and half crazy, made him feel like Durrett's crying had that day behind Tracker Brothers. He hoped to God Underhill was waiting for him. He couldn't tell. The snow was too thick to see the far end of the paddock. But he would be there soon enough, and then he would know. Kurtz had everything on but one boot when the alarm went off and the emergency lights went on, flooding this godforsaken piece of ground with even more glare. He felt no surprise, no dismay, only a mixture of relief and chagrin. Relief and chagrin. Relief that whatever he had been chewing on his nerve endings was now out in the open. Chagrin that this fucking mess hadn't held off for another 2 hours. Another 2 hours and he could have balanced the books on the whole deal. He jerked open the door of the Winnebago with his right hand, still holding his other boot in his left. A savage roaring came from the barn, a sort of warrior's cry to which his heart responded in spite of everything. The gale force wind thinned it a little, but not much. They were all in it together, it seemed. From somewhere in their well-fed, timorous, it can't happen here ranks, a Spartacus had risen. Who would have thunk it? It's the goddamn telepathy, he thought. His instincts, always superb, told him this was a serious trouble, that he was watching an operation go tits up on a truly grand scale, but he was smiling in spite of that. Got to be the goddamn telepathy. They smelled out what was coming and someone decided to do something about it. As he watched, a motley mob of men, most in parkas and orange hats, came moiling down the sagging, shattered barn doors. One fell on the splintered board and was impaled like a vampire. Some stumbled in the snow and were trampled under. All the lights were on now. Kurtz felt like a man with a ringside seat at a prize fight. He could see everything. Wings of escapees, 50 or 60 in each complement, peeled off as neatly as squads in a drill team and charged at the fence on the other side of the ratty little store. Either they didn't know there was a lethal dose of electricity coursing through the smooth wire, or they didn't care. The rest of them, the main body, charged directly at the back of the store. That was the weakest point in the perimeter, but it didn't matter. Kurtz thought it was all going to go. Never in any of his contingency plans had he had so much as considered this scenario. 200 or 300 overweight November warriors mounting a no-guts, no-glory banzai charge. He had never expected them to do anything but stay put, clamoring to due process right up to the point where they were barbecued. "Not bad, boys," Kurtz said. He smelled something else starting to burn, probably his goddamn career. But the end had been coming anyway, and he had picked one hell of an operation to go out on, hadn't he? As far as Kurtz was concerned, the little grey men from space was strictly secondary. If he ran the news, the headline above the fold would read, "Surprise! New Age Americans show some backbone." Outstanding. It was almost a shame to cut them down. The general quarters siren rose and fell in the snowy night. The first wave of men hit the back of the store. Kurtz could almost see the whole place shudder. "That goddamn telepathy," Kurtz said, grinning. He could see his guys responding. The first wave from the sentry huts, more coming from the motor pool, the commissary, and the semi-trailer boxes that were serving as makeshift barracks. Then the smile on Kurtz's face began to fade, replacing an expression of puzzlement. "Shoot them!" he said. "Why don't you shoot them?" Some were firing, but not enough. Nowhere near enough. Kurtz thought he smelled panic. His men weren't shooting because they had gone chicken shit, or because they knew they were next. The goddamn telepathy, he said again, and suddenly automatic rifle fire began inside the store. The windows of the office where he and Owen Underhill had had their original conference lit in brilliant stutter flashes of light. 2 of them blew out. A man attempted to exit the second of these, and Kurtz had time to recognize George Urol before George was seized by the legs and jerked back inside. The guys in the office were fighting at least, but of course they would. In there they were fighting for their lives. The laddybugs who had come running were, for the most part, still running. Kurtz thought about dropping his boot and grabbing his 9mm, shooting a few skedaddlers, bagging his limit. In fact, it was falling down all around him. Why not? Underhill, that was why not. Owen Underhill had played a part in this snafu. Kurtz knew that as well as he knew his own name. This stank of line crossing, and crossing the line was an Owen Underhill specialty. More shooting from Goslin's office, screams of pain, then triumphant howls. The computer-savvy, even drinking, salad-eating goths had taken their objective. Kurtz slammed the Winnebago's door on the scene and hurried back to the bedroom to call Freddie Johnson. He was still carrying his boot. Cambry was on his knees behind old man Goslin's desk when the first wave of prisoners smashed its way in. He was opening drawers, looking frantically for a gun. The fact that he didn't find one very likely saved his life. "Now! Now! Now!" The oncoming prisoners screamed. There was a monstrous thud against the back of the store, as if the truck had driven into it. From outside, Cambry could hear a juicy crackling sound as the first detainees hit the fence. The lights in the office began to flicker. "Stand together, men!" Danny O'Brien cried. "For the love of Christ, stand together!" The rear door came off its hinges with so much force that it actually skittered backward across the room, shielded the first of the screaming men who clogged the doorway. Cambry ducked, his hands laced over the back of his head, and the door fell on the desk at an angle with him beneath it, in the knee hole. The sounds of rifles on full auto was deafening in the tiny room, drowning out even the screams of the wounded, but Cambry understood that not all of them were firing. Trzaskowski, Urol, and O'Brien were, but Coleman, Everett, and Ray Parsons were only standing there with their weapons held to their chests and dazed expressions on their faces. From his accidental shelter, Gene Cambry saw the prisoners charge across the room, saw the first of them caught by the bullets and thrown like scarecrows, saw their blood splash across the walls and the Bean Supper posters and the OSHA notices. He saw George Urol throw his gun at two beefy young men in orange, then whirl and lunge at one of the windows. George got halfway out and then yanked back, a man with Ripley growing on his cheek like a birthmark. The man with Ripley growing on his cheek like a birthmark sank his teeth into George's calf as if it were a turkey drumstick, while other man silenced the screaming head at the other end of George's body by jerking it briskly to the left. The room was blue with powder smoke, and he saw Al Coleman throw his gun down and pick up the chant, "Now! Now! Now!" And he saw Ray Parsons, normally the most pacific of men, turn his rifle on Danny O'Brien and blow his brains out. Now the matter was simple. Now it was just the infected versus the immune. The desk was hit and slammed against the wall. The door fell on top of Cambry, and before he could get up, people were running over the door, squashing him. He felt like a cowboy who has fallen off his horse during a stampede. "I'm going to die under here," he thought, and then for a moment, the murderous pressure was gone. He lunged to his knees, driving with adrenaline-loaded muscles, and the door slid off him to the left, saying goodbye with a vicious dig of the doorknob into his hip. Someone dealt him a passing kick in the ribcage. Another boot scraped by his right ear, and then he was up. The room was thick with smoke, crazy with shouts and screams. 4 or 5 bulky hunters were propelled into the wood stove, which tore free of its pipe and went crashing over to its side, spilling flaming chunks of maple onto the floor. Money and playing cards caught fire. There was a rancid smell of melting plastic poker chips. Those were Ray's, Cambry thought incoherently. He had them in the Gulf, Bosnia, too. He stood ignored in the confusion. There was no need for the escaping internees to use the door between the office and the store. The entire wall, no more than a flimsy partition, really had been smashed flat. Pieces of this stuff were also catching fire from the overturned stove. "Now!" Gene Cambry muttered. "Now!" He saw Ray Parsons running with the others toward the front of the store, Howie Everett at his heels. Howie snatched a loaf of bread as he ran down the center aisle. The scrawny old party with a tasseled cap and an overcoat was pushed forward onto the overturned stove and then stomped flat. Cambry heard his high-pitched, squealing screams as his face bonded to the metal and he began to boil. Heard it and felt it. "Now!" Cambry shouted, giving in and joining the others. "Now!" He broad-jumped the growing flames from the stove and ran, losing his little mind in the big one. For all practical purposes, Operation Blue Boy was over. 3/4 of the way across the paddock, Henry paused, gasping for breath and clutching at his hammering chest. Behind him was the pocket Armageddon he had unleashed. Ahead of him, he could see nothing but darkness. Fucking Underhill had run out of him. Had. Easy, beautiful, easy. Lights flashed out twice. Henry had been looking in the wrong place, that was all. Owen was parked a little to the left of the paddock's southwest corner. Now Henry could see the snowcat's boxy outline clearly. From behind him came screams, shouts, orders, shooting. Not as much shooting as he would have expected, but this was no time to wonder why. "Hurry up!" Owen cried. "We have to get out of here!" "I'm coming as fast as I can, hold on!" Henry got moving again. Whatever had been in Owen's kickstart pills were already wearing off, and his feet felt heavy. His thigh itched maddeningly, and so did his mouth. He could feel the stuff creeping over his tongue. It was like a soft ring fizz that wouldn't go away. Owen had cut the fence, both the barbed wire and the smooth. Now he stood in front of the snowcat. It was white to match the snow, and it was really no wonder why Henry hadn't seen it. With an automatic rifle propped against his hip, attempting to look everywhere at once, the multiple lights gave him 6 shadows. They radiated out of his boots like crazy clock hands. Owen grabbed Henry around the shoulders. "You okay?" Henry nodded. As Owen began to pull him toward the snowcat, there was a loud, high-pitched explosion as if someone had fired the world's largest carbine. Henry ducked and stumbled over his own feet and would have fallen if Owen hadn't held him up. "What?" "LP gas. Gasoline too, maybe. Look." Owen took him by the shoulders and turned him around. Henry saw a vast pillar of fire in the snowy night. Bits of the store, boards, shingles, flaming boxes of Cheerios, burning rolls of toilet paper rose into the sky. Some of the soldiers were watching this, mesmerized. Others were running for the woods, in pursuit of the prisoners. Henry assumed, although he was hearing their panic in the head, "Run! Run! Now! Now!" and simply could not credit it. Later, when he had time to think, he would understand that many of the soldiers were also fleeing. Now he understood nothing. Things were happening too fast. Owen turned him around again and boosted him into the snowcat's passenger seat, pushing him past a hanging canvas flap that smelled strongly of motor oil. It was blessedly warm in the cat's gab. A radio bolted to the rudimentary dashboard chattered and squawked. The only thing Henry could make out clearly was the panic in the voices. It made him savagely happy, happier than he had been since the afternoon the four of them had put the fear of God into Richie Granadu and his bullyrag buddies. And that's who was running this operation as far as Henry could see. A bunch of grown-up Richie Granadus armed with guns instead of dried-up pieces of dog shit. There was something between the seats. A box with 2 blinking amber lights. As Henry bent over it, curious, Owen Underhill snatched back the top hanging beside the driver's seat and flung himself into the cat. He was breathing hard and smiling as he looked at the burning store. "Be careful of that, brother," he said. "Mind the buttons." Henry lifted the box, which was about the size of David's beloved Scooby-Doo lunchbox, the buttons of which Owen had spoken were under the blinking lights. "What are they?" Owen turned the ignition key and the snowcat's hot engine rumbled into immediate life. The transmission ran off a high stick, which Owen jammed into gear. Owen was still smiling. In the bright light falling through the snowcat's windshield, Henry could now see a reddish-orange thread of Byrus growing beneath each of the man's eyes, like mascara. There was more in his brows. "Too much light in this place," he said. "We are gonna dial him down a little." He turned the cat in a surprisingly smooth circle. It's like being on a motorboat. Henry collapsed back inside the seat, holding the box with the blinking lights on his lap. He felt that if he didn't walk again for 5 years, that could be about right. Owen glanced at him as he drove the snowcat on a diagonal toward the snowbank enclosed ditch. That was the Swanee Pond Road. "You did it!" I doubted that you could. I freely admit it, but you pulled the fucker off. "I told you, I'm a motivational master. Besides," he said, "most of them really were going to die anyway." "Doesn't matter. You gave them a chance, and now..." There was more shooting, and it wasn't until a bullet whined off the metal just above their heads that Henry realized it was aimed at them. There was a brisk clank as another slug ricocheted off one of the snowcat's threads, and Henry ducked, as if that would do any good. Still smiling, Owen pointed out a gloved hand off to his right. Henry peered in that direction as 2 more slugs ricocheted off the cat's squat pillbox body. Henry cringed both times. Owen seemed to not even notice. Henry saw a cluster of trailer boxes, some with brand names like Cisco and Scott Paper on them. In front of the trailers was a colony of motorhomes, and in front of the biggest, a Winnebago that looked to Henry like a mansion on wheels, was 6 to 7 men, all firing at the snowcat. Although the range was long, the wind high, the snow still heavy, too many were hitting. Other men, some only partially dressed. One bruiser came sprinting through the snow, displaying a bare chest that would have looked at home on a comic book superhero, were joining the group. At its center stood a tall man with grey hair. Beside him was a stockier guy. As Henry watched, the skinny man raised his rifle and fired, seemingly without bothering to aim. There was a spang sound, and Henry sensed something pass right in front of his nose, a small wicked droning thing. Owen actually laughed. "The skinnier one with the grey hair is Kurtz. He's in charge, and that fucker can shoot." More bullets spanged off the cat's threads, its body. Henry sensed another one of those buzzing, hustling presences in the cab, and suddenly the radio was silent. The distance between them and the shooters clustered around the Winnebago was getting longer, but it didn't seem to matter. As far as Henry was concerned, all those fuckers could shoot. It was only a matter of time before any of them took a hit, and yet Owen looked happy. It occurred to Henry that he had hooked up with someone even more suicidal than him. The guy beside Kurtz is Freddie Johnson. Those Mouseketeers and all Kurtz boys are the ones who were supposed to, "Oops, look out!" Another spang, another whining steel bee. Between them this time, and suddenly the knob of the transmission stick was gone. Owen burst out laughing. "Kurtz!" he shouted. "Bet you a nickel, 2 years from mandatory retirement age and he still shoots like Annie Oakley." He hammered a fist on the steering yoke. "But that's enough. Fun is fun and done is done. Turn out their lights, beautiful." "Huh?" Still grinning, Owen jerked a thumb at the box with the blinking amber bulbs. The curved streaks of Byrus under his eyes now looked like war paint to Henry. "Push the buttons, bub. Push the buttons and yank down the shades." Suddenly, it was always sudden, always magical. The world felt away and Kurtz was in the zone. The scream of the blizzard wind, the pelt of the snow, the howl of the siren, the beat of the buzzer, all gone. Kurtz lost his awareness of Freddie Johnson next to him and the other Imperial Valleys gathering around. He fixed on the departing snowcat and nothing else. He could see Owen Underhill in the left seat. Right through the steel shell of the cab, he could see him, as if he, Abe Kurtz, were all at once equipped with Superman's X-ray vision. The distance was incredibly long, but it didn't matter. The next round he fired was going right into the back of Owen Underhill's treacherous, line-crossing head. He raised the rifle, sighted down. 2 explosions ripped the night, 2 of them close enough to hammer Kurtz and his men in the shockwave. A trailer box with words "Intel" inside, printed on it, rose into the air, turned over and came down on Spago's, the cook tent. "Holy Christ!" one of the men shouted. Not all of the lights went out. A half an hour wasn't long, and Owen had had time to equip only 2 of the Jennies with thermite charges. All the time muttering, Banbury Cross, ride a cock horse to Banbury Cross," under his breath. But suddenly, the fleeing snowcat was swallowed in moving fire-speckled shadows, and Kurtz dropped his rifle into the snow without discharging it. "Fuck a duck," he said tonelessly. Cease firing, you humps! Quit it! Praise Jesus! Inside! Every one of you but Freddy, join hands and pray for God the Father Almighty to get our asses out of the sling they're in. Come here, Freddy! Step lively!" The others, nearly a dozen, trooped up the steps to the Winnebago, looking uneasily at the burning generators, the blazing cook tent. Already the commissary tent next door was catching. The infirmary and the morgue would be next. Half the pole lights in the compound were out. Kurtz put his arm around Freddie Johnson's shoulders and walked him 20 paces into the blowing snow, which the wind was now lifting and carrying in veils that looked like mystic steam. Directly ahead of the 2 men, Gosselin's, what was left of it was burning merry hell. The barn had already caught. Its shattered doors gaped. "Freddy, do you love Jesus? Tell me the truth." Freddy had been through this before. It was a mantra. The boss was clearing his head. "I love him, boss." "Do you swear that's true?" Kurtz, looking keenly, looking through him, more than likely, planning ahead if such creatures of instinct could be said to plan. "As you face the eternal pit of hell of a lie." "I swear it's true." "You love him a lot, do you?" "Lots, boss." "More than a group, more than going in hot and getting the job done?" A pause. "More than you love me?" Not questions you wanted to answer wrong if you wanted to go on living. Fortunately, not hard ones either. "No, boss." "Telepathy gone, Freddy?" "I had a touch of something. I don't know if it was telepathy. Exactly voices in my head." Kurtz was nodding. Red gold flames, the color of Ripley fungus, burst through the roof of the barn. "But that's gone." "Other men in the group?" Imperial Valley, you mean?" Freddy nodded toward the Winnebago. "Who else would I mean? The Firehouse 5 plus 2? Yes, them." They're clean, boss." "That's good, but that's also bad, Freddy. We need a couple of infected Americans. And when I say we, I mean you and I. I want Americans who are crawling with that red shit. Understand me?" I do." What Freddy didn't understand was why, but at the moment, the why didn't matter. He could see Kurtz taking hold, visibly taking hold, and that was a relief. When Freddy needed to know, Kurtz would tell him. Freddy looked uneasily at the blazing store, the blazing barn, the blazing cook tent. This situation was foobar. Or maybe not. Not if Kurtz was taking hold. Goddamn telepathy is responsible for most of this, Kurtz mused. But it wasn't telepathy that triggered it. That was pure human fuckery, praise Jesus. Who betrayed Jesus, Freddy? Who gave him the traitor's kiss? Freddy had just read his Bible, mostly because Kurtz has given it to him. Judas, boss. Kurtz was nodding rapidly. His eyes were moving everywhere. tabulating the destruction, calculating the response, which would be severely limited by the storm. That's right, Buck. Judas betrayed Jesus, and Owen Philip Underhill betrayed us. Judas got 30 pieces of silver. Not much of a payday, do you think? No, boss. He delivered his reply, partially turned away from Kurtz, because something in the commissary had exploded. A steel hand clutched his shoulder and turned him back. Kurtz's eyes were wide and burning. The white lashes made him look like ghost eyes. "Look at me when I talk to you," Kurtz said. "Listen to me when I speak to you." Kurtz put his free hand on the 9mm grip. "Or I'll blow your guts out on the snow. I've had a hard night here, and don't you make it any worse, you hound. Do you understand me? Catch the old driftola." Johnson was a man of good physical courage, but now he felt something turn over his stomach and tried to crawl away. Yes, boss, I'm sorry." "Accept it. God loves and forgives. We must do the same. I don't know how many pieces of silver Owen got, but I can tell you this. We are going to catch him. We're going to spread his cheeks, and we're going to tear that boy a splendid new asshole. Are you with me?" Yes. There was nothing Freddy wanted more than to find the person who has turned his previously ordered world upside down and fucked that person over. How much of this do you reckon Owen's responsible for, boss?" "Enough for me," Kurtz said serenely. "I have an idea. I'm finally going down, Freddy." "No, boss." "But I won't go down alone." Arm still around Freddy's shoulders, Kurtz began to lead his new second back toward the baggo. Squat, dying pillars of fire marked the burning jennies. Underhill had done that, one of the Kurtz's own boys. Freddy still found it difficult to believe, but he had begun to get steamed just the same. "How many pieces of silver, Owen? How many did you get, you traitor?" Kurtz stopped at the foot of the steps. "Which one of those fellows would like to command a search and destroy mission, Freddy?" "Gallagher, boss." "Kate?" "That's right. She a cannibal, Freddy. A person we leave in charge has to be a cannibal." "She eats them raw with slaw, boss." "Okay," Kurtz said. "Because this is going to be dirty, I need 2 Ripley positives, hopefully blue boy guys. The rest of them like the animals, Freddy. Imperial Valley is now a search and destroy mission. Gallagher and the rest are to hunt down as many as they can. Soldiers and civilians alike. From now until 1200 hours tomorrow, it's feeding time. After that, it's every man for himself, except for us, Freddy." The firelight painted Kurtz's face with Byrus, turned his eyes into Weasel's eyes. "We're going to hunt down Owen Underhill and teach him to love the Lord." Kurtz bounded up the Winnebago steps, sure as a mountain goat on the packed and slippery snow. Freddy Johnson followed him. The snowcat plunged down the embankment on the Swanee Pond Road, fast enough to make Henry's stomach roll over. It slewed. It turned south. Owen worked the clutch and mangled the stick shift, working the cat through the gears and into the high. With the galaxies of snow flying at their windshield, Henry felt as if they were traveling at approximately Mach 1. He guessed it might actually be 35 miles an hour. That would get them away from Gosselin's, but he had an idea Jonesy was moving much faster. "Turnpike ahead?" Owen asked. "It is, isn't it?" "Yes, about 4 miles. We need to switch vehicles when we get there. No one gets hurt if we help it, and no one gets killed. Henry, I don't know how to break it to you, but this isn't high school basketball. No one gets hurt, no one gets killed, at least not when we are swapping vehicles. Agree to that, or I'm rolling out of this door right now." Owen glanced at him. "You would too, wouldn't you? And goddamn, your friend's got planned for the world." "My friend isn't responsible for any of this. He's been kidnapped." Alright, no one gets hurt when we swap over. We can help it and no one gets killed except maybe us. Now, where are we going? Derry. That's where he is? The last surviving alien? I think so. In any case, I have a friend in Derry who can help us. He sees the line. What line? Never mind, Henry said and thought. It's complicated. What do you mean complicated? And no bounds, no play, what's that? I'll tell you when we are driving south if I can. The snowcat rolled towards the interstate, a capsule preceded by the glare of its lights. Tell me again what we are going to do, Owen said. Save the world. And tell me what that makes us. I need to hear it. It makes us heroes, Henry said. Then he put his head back and closed his eyes. In seconds, he was asleep. Jonesy had no idea what time it was when the green dysart's sign twinkled out of the snowy gloom. The Ram's dashboard clock was bitched up, just flashing 12 a.m. over and over, but it was still dark and still snowing hard. Outside of Derry, the plows were losing their battles with the storm. The stolen ram was a pretty good goer, as Jonesy's pop would have said, but it too was losing its battle, slipping and slewing more frequently in the deepening snow, fighting its way through the drifts with increasing difficulty. Jonesy had no idea where Mr. Gray thought he was going, but Jonesy didn't believe he would get there. Not in this storm, not in this truck. The radio worked, but not very well. So far, everything that came through was faint, blurred with static. He heard no time checks, but picked up a weather report. The storm had switched over to rain from Portland south, but from Augusta to Brunswick, the radio said, the precipitation was a wicked mix of sleet and freezing rain. Most communities were without power, and nothing without chains on its wheels was moving. Jonesy liked this news just fine. When Mr. Gray turned the steering wheel to head up the ramp and toward the beckoning green sign, the ram pickup slid broadside, spraying up great clouds of snow. Jonesy knew he likely would have gone off the exit ramp and into the ditch where he'd been in control, but he wasn't. And although he was no longer immune to Jonesy's emotions, Mr. Gray seemed much less prone to panic in a stress situation. Instead of wrenching blindly against the skid, Mr. Gray turned into it, held the wheel over until the slide stopped, then straightened the truck out again. The dog sleeping in the passenger footwell never woke up, and Jonesy's pulse barely rose. If he had been in control, Jonesy knew his heart would be hammering like hell. But of course, his idea of what to do with the car when it stormed like this was to put it in the garage. Mr. Gray obeyed the stop sign at the top of the ramp. Although Route 9 was drifted wasteland in either direction, across from the ramp was a huge parking lot brilliantly lit by the arc sodiums. Beneath their glare, the wind-driven snow seemed to move like the frozen respiration of an enormous, unseen beast. On an ordinary night, Jonesy knew that yard would have been full of rumbling diesel semis, Kenworths and Macs and Jimmy Pete's, with their green and amber cab lights glimmering. Tonight the area was almost deserted, except for the area marked long-term C-Yard manager must have ticket. In there were a dozen or more freight haulers, their edges softened by the drifts. Inside, their drivers would be eating, playing pinball, watching Spankovision in the trucker's lounge, or trying to sleep in the grim dormitory out back. There, $10 got you a cot, a clean blanket, and a scenic view of a cinder block wall. All of them, no doubt, thinking the same two thoughts. When can I roll, and how much is this going to cost me? Mr. Gray stepped down on the gas, and although he did it gently, as Jonesy's file concerning winter driving suggested, all four of the pickup wheels spun, and the truck began to jitter sideways, digging itself in. "Go on," Jonesy cheered from his position in the office window. "Go on, stick it right up to the rocker panels, because when you're stuck in a four-wheel drive, you're really stuck." Then the wheels caught, first the front ones, where the weight of the motor gave the ram a little more traction than the back ones. The ram trundled across and toward the sign marked entrance. Beyond it was another, "Welcome to the best truck stop in New England." Then the truck's headlights picked out a third, snow-caked but readable, "Hell, welcome to the best truck stop on Earth." "Is this the best truck stop on Earth?" Mr. Gray asked. "Of course," Jonesy said, and then he couldn't help it. He burst out laughing. "Why would you do that? Why would you make that sound?" Jonesy realized an amazing thing about touching and terrifying. Mr. Gray was smiling with Jonesy's mouth. Not much, just a little, but it was a smile. He doesn't really know what laughter is, Jonesy thought. Of course, he hadn't known what anger was either, but he had proved to be a remarkably fast learner. He could now tantrum with the best of them. What you said struck me funny." "What exactly is funny?" Jonesy had no idea how to answer the question. He wanted Mr. Gray to experience the entire gamut of human emotions, suspecting that humanizing this usurper might ultimately be his only chance of survival. "We have met the enemy, and he is us," Pogo had once said. Now, how do you explain funny to a collection of spores from another world? And what was funny about Dysart's proclaiming itself the best truck stop on Earth? Now they were passing yet another sign, one with arrows pointing left and right. "Big uns," it said beneath the left arrow, and "little uns" under the right. "Which are we?" Mr. Gray asked, stopping at the sign. Jonesy could have made him retrieve the information, but what would have been the point? "We are Little Un," he said. And Mr. Gray turned the ram to the right. The tires spun a little and the truck lurched. Lad raised his head, let fly another long and fragrant fart, then whined. His lower midsection had swelled and descended. Anyone who didn't know better would no doubt have mistaken him for a bitch about to give birth to a good-sized litter. There were perhaps 24 cars in pickup. pickups parked in the Little Un's lot. The ones most deeply buried in snow belonging to the help, mechanics, always one or two on duty, waitresses, short-order cooks. The cleanest vehicle there, Jonesy saw with sharp interest, was a powder blue state police car with packed snow around the roof lights. Being arrested would certainly put a spike in Mr. Gray's plans. On the other hand, Jonesy had already been present in 3 murder sites, if you counted the cab of the pickup. No witnesses at the first 2 crime scenes, and probably no Gary Jones fingerprints either. But here, sure, plenty of them. He could see himself standing in a courtroom somewhere and saying, "But Judge, it was the alien inside me who committed those murders." It was Mr. Gray. Another joke that Mr. Gray wouldn't get. That worthy, meanwhile, he was rummaging again. "Dry farts," he said. "Why would you call this place Dry Farts when the sign says Dysart's?" "That's what Lamar used to call it," Jonesy said, remembering long, hilarious breakfasts here, usually going or coming back from hole in the wall. And this fit right into the tradition, didn't it? My dad called it that too. Is it funny? Moderately, I guess. It's a pun based on similar sounds. Puns is what we call the lowest form of humor. Mr. Gray parked in the rank closest to the lighted island of the restaurant, but all the way down from the state police cruiser. Jonesy had no idea if Mr. Gray understood the significance of the light bars on top or not. He reached for the ram's headlight knob and pushed it in. He reached for the ignition, then stopped and issued several hard barks of laughter. Ha, 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 ha. How did that feel? Jonesy asked, more than a little curious, a little apprehensive too. Like nothing, Mr. Gray said flatly and turned off the ignition, but then sitting there in the dark with the wind howling around the cab of the truck, he did it again and with a little more conviction. Ha, 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 ha. In his office refuge, Jonesy shivered. It was a creepy sound like a ghost trying to remember how to be human. Lad didn't like it either. He whined again, looking uneasily at the man behind the steering wheel of his master's truck. Owen was shaking Henry awake, and Henry responded reluctantly. He felt as if he had gone to sleep only seconds ago. His limbs all seemed to have been dipped in cement. I'm here. Left leg itching, mouth itching even worse. The goddamn Byrus was growing on his lips now too. He rubbed it off with his forefinger, surprised at how easily it broke free, like a crust. Listen up and look. Can you look? Henry looked up the road, which was now dim and snow-ghostly. Owen had pulled the snowcat over and turned off the lights. Farther along, there were mental voices in the dark, the auditory equivalent of a campfire. Henry went to them. There were 4 of them, young men with no seniority in blue group. Owen whispered, "This time we are blue group." 4 young men with no seniority in blue group, trying not to be scared, trying to be tough, voices in the dark, a little campfire of voices in the dark. By its light, Henry discovered he could see dimly. Snow, of course, and a few flashing yellow lights illuminating a turnpike entrance ramp. There was also a lid of a pizza carton, seen in the light of an instrument panel. It had been turned into a tray. On it were saltines, several blocks of cheese, and a Swiss Army knife. The Swiss Army knife belonged to the one named Smitty, and they were all using it to cut the cheese. The longer Henry looked, the better he saw. It was like having your eyes adjust to the dark, but it was more than that too. And what he saw had a creepy, giddy depth, as if all at once the physical world consisted not only of 3 dimensions, but of 4 or 5. It was easy enough to understand why. He was seeing through 4 sets of eyes, all at the same time. They were huddled together in the Humvee. Owen said, delighted. It's a fucking Humvee, Henry. Custom equipped for snow too. Bet you anything it is. The young men were sitting close together. Yes, but still in 4 different places, looking at the world from 4 different points of view, with 4 different qualities of eyesight, ranging from eagle-eye sharp, Dana from Maybrook, New York, to the merely adequate. Yet somehow, Henry's brain was processing them, just as it turned multiple still images on a reel of film on a moving picture. This wasn't like a movie though, nor like some tricky 3D image. It was an entirely new way of seeing, the kind that could produce a whole new way of thinking. If that shit spreads, Henry thought, both terrified and wildly excited. If it spreads. Owen's elbow thumped into his side. Maybe you could save the seminar for another day, he said. Look across the road. Henry did so, employing his unique quadruple vision and realizing only belatedly that he had done more than look. He had moved their eyeballs so he could peer over to the far side of the turnpike, where he saw more blinking lights in the storm. It's a choke point, Owen muttered. one of Kurtz's insurance policies. Both exits blocked, no movement onto the turnpike without authorization. I want the Humvee. It's the best thing we could have in a shitstorm like this, but I don't want to alert the guys on the other side. Can we do that? Henry experimented with their eyes again, moving them. He discovered that as soon as they weren't all looking at the same thing, the sense of godlike 4 or 5 dimensional vision evaporated, leaving him with a nauseating, shattered perspective his processing equipment couldn't cope with. But he was moving them. Not much, just their eyeballs. But I think if we can work together, Henry told them. Get closer and stop talking out loud. Get in my head. Link up. Suddenly, Henry's head was fuller. His vision clarified again. But this time, the perspective wasn't quite as deep. Only 2 sets of eyes instead of 4. His and Owen's. Owen put the snowcat into first gear and crept forward with the lights off. The engine's low growl was lost beneath the constant shriek of the wind. As they closed the distance, Henry felt his hold on those mines ahead tightening. Holy shit, Owen said, half laughing and half gasping. What is it? It's you. Man, it's like being on a magic carpet. Christ, but you're strong. You think I'm strong? Wait till you meet Jonesy. Owen stopped the snowcat below the brow of the little hill. Beyond it was the turnpike. Not to mention Bernie, Dana, Tommy and Smitty sitting in their Humvee at the top of their southbound ramp, eating cheese and crackers off their makeshift tray. He and Owen was safe enough from discovery. The 4 young men in the Humvee were clean of the Byrus and had no idea they were being scoped. Ready? Henry asked. I guess. The other person in Henry's head, cool as that storied cucumber when Kurtz and the others had been shooting at them, was now nervous. You take the lead, Henry. I'm just flying support this mission. Here we go. What Henry did next, he did instinctively, binding the 4 men in the Humvee together, not with the images of death and destruction, but by impersonating Kurtz. To do this, he drew on both Owen Underhill's energy, much greater than his own at this point, and Owen Underhill's vivid knowledge of his OIC. The act of binding gave them a brilliant stab of satisfaction, relief as well. Moving their eyes was one thing, taking them over completely was another, and they were free of the Byrus. They could have made them immune. Thank God it did not. There's a snowcat over that rise east of you, laddies, Kurtz said. Want you to take it back to the base. Right now, if you please. No questions, no comments, just get moving. You'll find the quarters a little tight compared to your current accommodations, but I think you all can fit in, praise Jesus. Now move your humps. God love you. Henry saw them getting out, their faces calm and blank around the eyes. He started to get out himself and then saw Owen was still sitting in the snowcat's driver's seat, his own eyes wide. His lips moved, forming the words in his head. Move your humps. God love you. Owen, come on! Owen looked around, startled, then nodded and pushed out through the canvas hanging over his side of the cat. Henry stumbled to his knees, picked himself up, and looked wearily into the streaming dark. Not far to go, God knew it wasn't, but he didn't think he could slog through another 20 feet of drifted snow, let alone 150 yards. On and on the Eggman went, he thought, and then, I did it. That's the answer, of course. I offed myself and now I'm in hell. This is the Eggman and... Owen's arm went around him. It was more than his arm. He was feeding Henry his strength. Thank you. Thank me later. Sleep later too. For now, keep your eye on the ball. There was no ball. There were only Bernie, Dana, Tommy and Smitty trooping through the snow, a line of silent somnambulists in coveralls and hooded parkas. They trooped east on the Swanee Pond Road toward the snowcat, while Owen and Henry struggled on west toward the abandoned Humvee. The cheese and saltines had also been abandoned, Henry realized, and his stomach rumbled. Then the Humvee was dead ahead. They drive it away, no headlights at first, low gear and quiet, skirting the yellow flashes at the base of the ramp, and if they were lucky, the fellas guarding the northbound ramp would never know they were gone. If they do see us, could we make them forget? Owen asked. Give them amnesia? Henry realized they probably could. Owen! What? If this ever got out, it would change everything. Everything! A pause as Owen considered this. Henry wasn't talking about knowledge, the usual coin of Kurtz's boss up the food chain. He was talking about abilities that apparently went beyond a little mind reading. I know, he replied at last. They headed south in the Humvee, south into the storm. Henry Devlin was still gobbling crackers and cheese when exhaustion turned down the lights in his overstimulated head. He slept with crumbs on his lips and dreamed of Josie Rickenhauer. Half an hour after it caught fire, old Reggie Gosselin's barn was no more than a dying dragon's eye in the booming night, waxing and waning in the black socket of melted snow. From the woods east of the Swanee Pond Road came the pop of the rifle fire, heavy at first, then diminishing a little in both frequency and volume as the Imperial Valleys, Kate Gallagher's Imperial Valleys now, pursued the escaped detainees. It was a turkey shoot, and not many of the turkeys were going to get away. Enough of them to tell the tale, maybe, enough to rat them all out. That was tomorrow's worry. All this was going on, also while the treacherous Owen Underhill was getting farther and farther ahead of them. Kurtz and Freddie Johnson stood in the command post, except Freddie supposed it was now nothing but a Winnebago again. That feeling of power and importance had gone, flipping playing cards into a hat. No longer telepathic in the slightest, but as sensitive to the men under him as ever. That his command had been reduced to a single soldier really made no difference. Kurtz looked at Freddie and said, "Make haste slowly, Buck. That's one saw that's still sharp." "Yes, boss," Freddie said without much enthusiasm. Kurtz flipped the two of spades. It fluttered down through the air and landed in the hat. Kurtz crowed like a child and prepared to flip again. There was a knock at the Bago's door. Freddie turned in that direction and Kurtz fixed him with a forbidding look. Freddie turned back and watched Kurtz flip another card. This one started out well, then went long and landed on Cap's bill. Kurtz muttered something under his breath, then nodded at the door. Freddie, with a mental prayer of thanks, went to open it. Standing on the top step was Jocelyn McAvoy, one of the two female Imperial Valleys. Her accent was soft country Tennessee. The face under the boy-cropped blonde hair was hard as stone. She was holding a spectacularly non-registered Israeli burp gun by the strap. Freddie wondered where she had gotten such a thing, then decided it didn't matter. A lot of things had ceased to matter, most of them in the last hour or so. "Joss," Freddie said, "what's up with your bad self?" Delivering 2 Ripley positives as ordered. More shooting from the woods, and Freddie saw the woman's eyes shift minutely in that direction. She wanted to get back over there, across the road, wanted to bag her limit before the game was gone. Freddie knew how she felt. "Send them in, lassie," Kurtz said. He was still standing over the cap on the door. The floor that was still faintly stained with Cook's third Melrose's blood, still holding the deck of cards in his hand. But his eyes were bright and interested. "Let's see who you found." Jocelyn gestured with her gun. A male voice at the foot of the stairs growled, "The fuck up there, don't make me say it twice." The first man to step past Jocelyn was tall and very black. There was a cut down one of his cheeks and another on his neck. Both cuts had been clogged with Ripley. More was growing in the creases of his brow. Freddie knew the face, but not the name. The old man, of course, knew both. Freddie supposed he remembered the names of all the men he had commanded, both the quick and the dead. "Cambry," Kurtz said, eyes lighting even more brightly. He dropped the playing cards into the hat, approached Cambry, seemed about to shake hands, thought better of it, and snapped off a salute instead. Gene Cambry did not return it. He looked sullen and disoriented. "Welcome to the Justice League of America." Spotted him running through the woods along with the detainees he was supposed to be guarding, Jocelyn McAvoy said. Her face was expressionless. All her contempt was in her voice. "Why not?" Cambry asked. He looked at Kurtz. "You were going to kill me anyway. Kill all of us. Don't bother lying about it either. I can see it in your mind." Kurtz wasn't discomfited by this in the slightest. He rubbed his hand together and smiled at Cambry in a friendly way. "Do a good job and perhaps you'll change my mind back. Hearts were made to be broken and minds were made to be changed. That's a big praise, God. What else have you got for me, Joss?" Freddie regarded the second figure with amazement, along with pleasure. The Ripley couldn't have found a better home in his humble opinion. Nobody liked the son of a bitch much in the first place. Sir, boss, I don't know why I'm here. I was in a proper pursuit of the escapees when I'm sorry I have to say this, when this officious bitch pulled me out of the sweep area and..." "He was running with them," McAvoy said with a bored voice. "Running with them and infected up the old wazoo." "A lie," said a man in the doorway. "A total lie. I'm perfectly clean, 100%. McAvoy snatched off the watch cap her second prisoner was wearing. The man's thinning blonde hair was much thicker now and appeared to have been dyed red. "I can explain, sir," Archie Perlmutter said, his voice fading even as he spoke. "There is... you see..." Then it died away entirely. Kurtz was beaming at him, but he had donned his filter mask again. They all had, and it gave his reassuring smile an oddly sinister look, the expression of a child molester inviting a little kid in for a piece of pie. "Pearly, it's going to be all right," Kurtz said. "We're going for a ride, that's all. There's someone we need to find. Someone you know." "Owen Underhill," Perlmutter whispered. "That's right, Buck," Kurtz said. He turned to McAvoy. "Bring this soldier his clipboard, McAvoy. I'm sure he'll feel better once he has his clipboard. Then you can carry on hunting, which I feel quite sure you are eager to do." "Yes, boss. But first, watch this, a little trick I learned back in Kansas." Kurtz sprayed the cards. In the crazy blizzard wind coming through the door, they flew every which way. Only one landed face up in the hat, but it was the ace of spades. Mr. Gray held the menu, looking at the list of stuff: meatloaf, sliced beets, roast chicken, chocolate silk pie, with interest and an almost total lack of understanding. Jonesy realized it wasn't just not knowing how food tasted. Mr. Gray didn't know what taste was. How could he? When you cut to the chase, he was nothing but a mushroom with a high IQ. Here came a waitress, moving under a vast tableland of frozen ash blonde hair. The badge on her not inconsiderable bosom read, "Welcome to Dysart's, I'm your waitress, Darlene. Hi, hon, what can I get you? I'd like scrambled eggs and bacon, crisp, not limp. Toast. How about canned cakes? She raised her eyebrows and looked at him over her pad. Beyond her, at the counter, the state trooper was eating some kind of dripping sandwich and talking with the short order cook. Sorry, cake pans, I mean to say. The eyebrows went higher. Her question was plain blinking at the front of her mind like a neon sign in a saloon window. Was this guy a mushmouth, or was he making fun of her?